Montana Territory. 1883, steel gray storm clouds gathered over the Bitterroot Mountains as a lone rider crested the ridge, silhouetted against the darkening horizon. The Winchester 73 strapped to his saddle glinted in the last rays of sunlight, a warning and a promise. Below Clearwater Basin, nestled in the valley, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to civilization's edge, like survivors of a shipwreck. To most, it was nothing, just another forgotten frontier outpost. To Joshua Blackwood, it was opportunity. He adjusted his Stetson, feeling the comfortable weight of the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. Behind him, 6 hardened men emerged from the tree line, their faces etched with the violence they'd left across 3 territories. "Looks peaceful," observed his brother Isaac, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. Blackwood's smile never reached his eyes. For now, in the trading post at the eastern edge of town, Eleanor Reed finished inventory with methodical precision. The worn leather of her father's rifle case, a reminder of the woman she once was, and might need to be again. The Kentucky long rifle hung above her door wasn't just an heirloom in her hands it had never missed. Some called it the devil's own luck. She called it survival from her weathered porch. Eleanor Reed surveyed the town she'd called home for nearly 2 decades. Clearwater Basin wasn't much a collection of rough-hewn buildings, clinging to civilization's edge like survivors of some forgotten shipwreck. Nestled between towering mountains and sprawling plains, it existed in that liminal space where law bent to necessity and survival trumped propriety. Eleanor's trading post stood at the eastern edge, built from timber that had weathered 20 harsh Montana winters. Its wide porch offered clear sight lines in all directions, a feature most attributed to her late husband's careful planning. Few suspected it had been Eleanor who'd insisted on this particular vantage point. At 45, Eleanor's face bore the lines of a hard-lived life, but her posture remained ramrod straight, her movements precise and economical. Her auburn hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was pulled back in a practical braid. She wore a simple gray dress beneath a well-worn leather apron, her sleeves rolled to reveal forearms strong from years of honest labor. Inside, lanterns cast a warm glow over shelves stocked with necessities, flour, coffee, ammunition tools, and occasional luxuries from back east. A pot-bellied stove radiated heat from the room's center, surrounded by chairs where travelers could warm themselves before continuing their journey. Above the door hung an old Kentucky long rifle, its wooden stock darkened with age and handling brass fittings gleaming in the lamplight. Locals knew better than to remark on its prominence. Newcomers often made the mistake of asking why such an outdated weapon held such pride of place when newer, faster guns were available. Eleanor rarely bothered explaining, let them think what they wanted. The rifle stayed where it was, within reach, but out of the way, like a slumbering guardian. Her hands moved methodically as she inventoried supplies in a leather-bound ledger, the quiet scratching of her pen interrupted by the creak of the door. Sheriff Daniel Wilson stepped inside, removing his hat as he approached the counter. At 53, Wilson was lean and graying, with eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. "Afternoon, Eleanor," he said, "just making my rounds." Eleanor nodded without looking up from her ledger. Wilson leaned against the counter, his gaze drifting to the shelves behind her. "Running low on supplies." "Wagon train's 3 weeks late," she replied, making another notation. "Miller swears they'll arrive by week's end." "What did he say last week?" Wilson asked, a wry smile touching his weathered face. Eleanor's pen paused. "And the week before?" She finally looked up, her gray-green eyes meeting his. "Something on your mind, Daniel?" The sheriff sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Got word from Helena yesterday. The Blackwood gang hit another settlement up north, emptied the general store, shot the owner when he tried to stop them." Eleanor's expression remained unchanged, but her grip on the pen tightened slightly. "They're moving south, then?" "Appears so." Wilson's gaze drifted to the rifle above the door. "Might be nothing, but thought you should know. Appreciate the warning." Eleanor returned to her ledger, the conversation clearly finished, as far as she was concerned. Wilson replaced his hat, then added, "They've got 7 riders now. Picked up some young hothead in Butte. More fools don't make for better odds." Eleanor replied without looking up. "Just makes for more noise." Wilson chuckled despite himself. Suppose that's true. His expression sobered. Still might want to close up early these next few days, at least until we know they moved on. Been closing this store at the same time for 15 years. Daniel, don't plan on changing that now. Wilson recognized the steel in her voice, had seen it before. He nodded, tipped his hat, and headed for the door. He paused with his hand on the knob, looking back. Robert would have wanted you safe, Eleanor. For a moment, something flickered across Eleanor's face, a shadow of something deeper than her customary stoicism. Then it vanished, replaced by the same unreadable mask. Robert isn't here. She said simply. Night had fallen over Clearwater Basin, the windows of Eleanor's living quarters, above the trading post illuminated by a single lamp. She moved to the chest at the foot of her bed, its worn wooden surface speaking of journeys long past. The hinges creaked as she lifted the heavy lid, revealing contents she hadn't examined in years. Carefully wrapped in oilcloth lay twin Colt revolvers, their pearl handles yellowed with age but still beautiful. Beneath them rested a stack of yellowed wanted posters. She lifted the topmost one, its illustration depicting a young woman with a determined expression in a $500 reward for her capture. The name printed below, Eleanor Hayes, alias Steady Hand. Hayes. Eleanor traced the outline of the face, one she barely recognized anymore. Long before she was Eleanor Reed, widow and shopkeeper of Clearwater Basin, she had been someone else entirely. She had been 17 when she killed her first man, a drunk who murdered her father and tried to assault her. By 21, circumstances and poor choices had led her to ride with the Faro Gang Outlaws, known for their precision and relatively minimal bloodshed. But when Faro had ordered the execution of hostages during their final job, Eleanor had turned her legendary marksmanship against him, saving innocent lives but earning a price on her head. She'd fled west, eventually meeting Robert Reed in Denver, and starting a new life far from her past. 15 years of peace had followed 15 years of being simply Eleanor Reed, shopkeeper's wife and then widow. 15 years of deliberately missing targets when forced to demonstrate her shooting during town celebrations, of keeping her skills hidden, of living an ordinary life. On the dresser sat a daguerreotype of Robert, his serious expression softened by the slight curve of his lips. Beside it lay a smaller image in an ornate silver frame turned face down. Eleanor picked it up slowly, turning it over. A young girl stared back, no more than 5, with Eleanor's eyes and Robert's smile. Sarah, she whispered the name itself, a prayer and a lament. Her daughter lost to fever the winter before Robert's death. Some days Eleanor could barely remember her face. Other days the memory was so vivid it felt like physical pain. She returned to the chest, rewrapping the guns and posters. No need for those yet. The rifle would be enough if trouble came. It always had been. Dawn broke over Clearwater Basin, with ribbons of pink and gold stretching across the eastern sky. Sheriff Wilson made his first rounds before sunrise, a habit formed during 30 years of wearing a badge. He walked the length of Main Street, boots crunching on hard-packed dirt, eyes scanning for anything unusual. The town felt different this morning. Quieter, more watchful. Word about the Blackwood gang had spread quickly, as news always did in small communities. Wilson paused outside Eleanor's trading post. Light already glowed behind the curtained windows, a sign that she was awake and moving about. She always rose with the sun, another habit that hadn't changed in all the years he'd known her. He hesitated before continuing on his way. Something about his conversation with Eleanor yesterday still nagged at him. Her calm in the face of potential danger wasn't surprising. She'd always been steady as bedrock, but there had been something else in her eyes when he mentioned the Blackwood gang. Not fear, something colder, more focused. Wilson had served as sheriff in 3 different territories over his long career. He'd developed an intuition for people could usually tell the difference between those who talked brave and those who lived it. Eleanor Reed fell firmly in the latter category, though he'd never quite understood why a shopkeeper's widow should have eyes that assess threats like a veteran soldier. At the far end of Main Street, Dr. Rebecca Palmer washed her hands in a basin of warm water, the scent of carbolic soap sharp in her small examination room. She'd been up most of the night with Martha Collins, who had delivered a healthy baby girl just before dawn. Mother and child were resting now, while Rebecca prepared for her regular morning appointments. Her husband James entered quietly, carrying a cup of coffee. At 42, James Palmer had the disheveled appearance of a man more comfortable with books than practical matters. His spectacles sat slightly askew on his nose, and his brown hair streaked with premature gray was perpetually rumpled. "Thought you could use this," he said, offering the cup. Rebecca accepted it gratefully. "Thank you. Did you get any sleep?" James shook his head. "Too much on my mind." He hesitated. "I was cleaning the shotgun last night. So I heard—" Rebecca sipped her coffee. "Harrison probably heard it too, and the Sullivans, possibly even the Blackwood gang. Wherever they are." James had the grace to look embarrassed. "I just want to be prepared." "I know," Rebecca's expression softened. "But you don't need to worry about me. I can take care of myself." "Against professional killers," James's voice rose slightly. "Becca, these men—" "I know who they are," she interrupted gently. "But panicking won't help." James removed his spectacles, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I should never have brought you to this God-forsaken place. We've had this conversation before I chose to come here, same as you." It was an old argument. James had accepted a position as the school teacher in Clearwater Basin 5 years ago, drawn by the promise of building a proper school in the frontier town. Rebecca had followed establishing her medical practice, despite initial resistance from some of the more traditional residents. "I know," James sighed. "I just worry." "As do I." Rebecca squeezed his hand. "But Eleanor's right. We can't make ourselves targets." "You spoke with her yesterday, at the trading post." Rebecca resumed preparing her instruments for the day ahead. She seemed different. Focused. "Different how?" Rebecca considered the question. "It's hard to explain. Eleanor's always been reserved, but yesterday there was something else, like she was assessing possibilities, making plans." "For what?" "I'm not sure." Rebecca arranged her stethoscope and other tools on a clean cloth. "But I got the impression she's faced situations like this before." James frowned. "She's a shopkeeper's widow." "She's a survivor," Rebecca corrected. "There's a difference." By mid-morning, Eleanor had already served a dozen customers, each bringing the same questions. Were the rumors true? Was the Blackwood gang really coming? What were they going to do? Eleanor offered the same measured responses. Nothing was certain. Sheriff Wilson was aware of the situation. The best thing to do was remain calm and go about normal business. What she didn't say was what she had done before opening the store that morning. She didn't mention the hours spent on the ridge behind her home, the Kentucky rifle in her hands, practicing shots she hadn't taken in years. She didn't speak of the satisfying thud as each bullet found its mark, or how her hands remembered the rifle's weight and balance as if no time had passed. Some skills once learned stayed in the blood. The bell above the door jangled once more, and Eleanor looked up to see Margaret Harrington enter. At 67, Margaret was one of Clearwater Basin's original settlers, having arrived with her late husband during the first mining boom 30 years prior. She now ran the small hotel with her grandson Michael, a quiet young man of 22. "Morning, Margaret." Eleanor greeted her. Margaret placed her basket on the counter. "Coffee, sugar, and some of that cinnamon if you still have it." Eleanor gathered the items, mentally calculating the total. "How's business at the hotel?" "Had 2 travelers stop yesterday, salesmen heading to Helena." Margaret watched Eleanor measure coffee beans into a paper sack. "They left this morning in quite a hurry after hearing about the Blackwood gang." Eleanor tied the sack closed. "People talk too much. Can't help it in a small town." Margaret lowered her voice. "Is it true what they're saying about what they did in Cedar Ridge?" "I don't put much stock in rumors," Eleanor replied evenly. Margaret studied her for a moment. "You know, Eleanor, in all the years I've known you, I've never seen you afraid of anything. Not even when Robert passed." Eleanor paused, her hands stilling on the counter. "Fear doesn't help anyone, Margaret. Just clouds the mind when you need it clear." Maybe Margaret placed coins on the counter, but sometimes it keeps you alive. Not in my experience. The older woman peered at Eleanor curiously. "And what experience would that be? You've been running this trading post for what, 15 years now?" Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "People change, Margaret. They adapt to what life gives them." "That they do." Margaret gathered her purchases. My Edward used to say you can tell what a person's made of by how they handle the worst days, not the best ones. Sounds like a wise man? He was. Margaret paused at the door. Whatever happens in the coming days, Eleanor, know that you've got friends in this town, more than you might think. After Margaret left, Eleanor stood at the counter turning over the conversation in her mind. She had worked hard to build a life in Clearwater Basin, a quiet, unremarkable life far removed from the person she had once been. For 15 years, she had been simply Eleanor Reed, widow and shopkeeper. Before that, she had been Robert's wife, focused on building their business and raising their daughter. But before Robert, before Sarah, she had been someone else entirely. Someone who wouldn't have hesitated to put a bullet through Joshua Blackwood's black heart the moment he showed his face in town. Eleanor glanced up at the Kentucky rifle above the door. It had been her father's and his father's before him, a family heirloom passed down through generations of Hayes men, each taught to respect its power and precision. Eleanor had learned to shoot with that rifle when her legs were barely long enough to brace properly against the recoil. By 12, she could hit targets other grown men couldn't see. By 16, she had earned the nickname that would eventually appear on wanted posters across 3 states. Myrayu, steady hand. Hayes had been dead and buried for 20 years. Eleanor Reed had made sure of that when she married Robert and turned her back on her old life. But standing in her store with the wind carrying rumors of approaching danger, Eleanor felt the ghost of that young woman stirring inside her once more. The bell jangled again, pulling Eleanor from her thoughts. Michael Harrington, Margaret's grandson, stood in the doorway, his expression troubled. "Miss Reed," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Riders coming, 7 of them from the east." Eleanor's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened at Michael's words. 7 riders, you say?" The young man nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed nervously. "Coming up slowly from the east trail. Grandmother sent me to warn you?" Eleanor moved from behind the counter with deliberate calm. "Thank you, Michael. Tell your grandmother to lock the hotel doors. No need to cause a panic, but best to be cautious." Michael hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Sheriff Wilson's not in his office. Deputy Parker's there, but he looks scared." "Of course he does," Eleanor murmured, almost to herself. She glanced up at the Kentucky rifle above the door, then back to Michael. "Go now. Warn who you can without causing a fuss." Dodo. Eleanor moved to the window, positioning herself to observe the street while remaining partially hidden by the curtain. The eastern approach to Clearwater Basin followed the old mining road, winding between dark pines before straightening for the final stretch into town. There they were, 7 riders moving at an unhurried pace, dust rising behind their horses in the clear autumn air. Still too distant to make out faces, but their silhouettes told their own story. Men who rode like that, relaxed yet alert, weren't simple travelers or salesmen. They moved with the confidence of predators entering familiar hunting grounds. Eleanor's mind raced through calculations. Wilson was somewhere in town, but not at his office. Parker was useless, barely 24. An inexperienced Sullivan might have the courage to stand against the riders, but he lacked the skill. The rest of the townspeople would either hide or, worse, try to defend themselves without knowing what they were up against. 7 against 1 weren't odds Eleanor would have chosen, but she'd faced worse in her younger days. She moved back behind the counter, her hands steady as she reached beneath it to where a loaded Colt revolver lay hidden. She didn't remove it, not yet, but knowing it was there provided a certain comfort. Then, with the same measured calm she displayed all morning, Eleanor continued her inventory as if nothing had changed, only her ears straining for the telltale sound of approaching hoofbeats. Outside, the town continued its morning routine, unaware of the danger riding toward them. A few people hurried across the street, likely warned by Michael, but most went about their business, oblivious to the approaching threat. Eleanor saw Dr. Palmer emerge from her office, scanning the street with a concerned expression before disappearing back inside. The minutes stretched, each one pulling tighter than the last. Then came the sound she'd been waiting for, hoofbeats growing louder as the riders entered the town proper. Eleanor didn't move, didn't look up from her ledger, but every muscle in her body tensed, ready. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. Voices drifted through the window, too distant to make out words, but clear enough to hear the arrogance in their tone. A woman's startled cry quickly muffled a man's nervous greeting, then boots on the wooden sidewalk outside her store. The bell jangled as the door swung open, and Eleanor finally looked up. 4 men entered, not the full 7, which meant the others were elsewhere in town. The one in front could only be Joshua Blackwood himself, tall and lean with dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. He had the look of a man who'd found his true calling in violence. His black duster was dusty from the trail, and the red bandana around his neck had seen better days. But his gun belt was polished and well-maintained, the revolver holstered with practiced care. Flanking him were 3 others, one barely out of his teens with a patchy attempt at a beard and fidgeting hands that kept straying to his gun belt. Another a hulking presence, with a face like weathered stone and dead eyes that swept the store's interior with professional assessment. The third thin and wiry with a scar running from temple to jawline. "Morning," Blackwood said, removing his hat with a mockery of politeness. "Fine establishment you have here, ma'am." Eleanor set her pencil down, her expression revealing nothing. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" Blackwood's mouth curved into what might have been called a smile on a different man. On him, it was merely a warning, like a rattlesnake's distinctive sound. "Just passing through, thought we might resupply before continuing our journey." "You'll find what you need on the shelves," Eleanor replied evenly. "Cash only, no credit." The younger man snickered, but Blackwood's false smile didn't waver. "Of course we're good for it, ain't we, boys?" He moved farther into the store, his spurs jingling with each step. "Webb, why don't you help the lady gather what we need?" The young one, Webb, moved toward the shelves, grabbing items at random and piling them on the counter. Coffee, tobacco, ammunition, canned goods. His movements were jerky, excited like a child allowed to run loose in a candy store. "Easy there." The larger man rumbled, his voice surprisingly soft for his size. "Don't need the whole damn store." "Tate." "Just being thorough, Quinn," Webb replied with a grin that showed too many teeth. Blackwood approached the counter, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. There was curiosity there, and something else, a predator's assessment, searching for weakness. "Don't believe I caught your name, ma'am." "Reed, Eleanor Reed." "Joshua Blackwood." He extended his hand across the counter. When Eleanor didn't immediately take it, his smile tightened. "Not very friendly, are you, Mrs. Reed?" "It's Miss," Eleanor corrected, still not taking his hand. "And I prefer to keep business professional." Blackwood withdrew his hand, the first hint of annoyance crossing his features. "Professional, is it? Well, I can respect that." His gaze drifted up to the rifle mounted above the door. "That's a fine piece. Kentucky long rifle, if I'm not mistaken. A bit outdated, though, wouldn't you say?" "It serves its purpose," Eleanor replied, tallying up the items Webb had piled on the counter. Blackwood chuckled. "Which is what decoration? Those old muzzle loaders can't compare to modern firearms. One shot and then you're in trouble." "One shot is all you need if you know how to use it." Eleanor said, her voice so matter-of-fact that it didn't register as a challenge until the words had already settled in the air. The atmosphere in the store shifted. Quinn straightened slightly, his hand drifting closer to his holster. Webb froze mid-reach for a tin of tobacco. Blackwood's smile vanished completely, replaced by a cold assessment. "Is that so?" he said softly. "That'll be $24. Eleanor replied, unmoved. For a long moment, Blackwood didn't move. Then deliberately he reached into his pocket and withdrew a handful of coins, counting them onto the counter one by one. The sound of metal on wood filled the tense silence. Webb smirked, then turned with a mocking grin. "Awful protective of an antique, ain't you?" He reached up, gripping the rifle as if to take it down. "Just curious what all the fuss is about." Eleanor moved with a speed that surprised even Blackwood. One moment she was behind the counter, the next she stood before Webb, her hand clamped around his wrist in a grip that made the young outlaw wince. "I said don't touch it." She didn't raise her voice and didn't need to. The cold fury in her eyes was enough. Webb tried to jerk his arm away but found himself unable to break her grip. Confusion, then anger flashed across his face. "What the hell? Let him go, Miss Reed," Blackwood said quietly. It wasn't a request. Eleanor held Webb's gaze for a moment longer, then released his wrist. The young outlaw stumbled back, rubbing the red marks her fingers had left. Crazy bitch, he muttered. Quinn chuckled softly. Warned you about touching. What ain't yours, kid? Blackwood studied Eleanor with newfound interest. The storekeeper's movements had been too quick, too confident for a simple shopkeeper. There was training there and experience. His curiosity deepened. My apologies for the boy's manners. Blackwood said, he's still learning the finer points of civilized behavior. Eleanor returned to the counter, continuing to wrap their purchases as if nothing had happened. If that's all you need, gentlemen, I have other customers waiting. There were no other customers in sight, and all of them knew it, but Blackwood simply nodded, gathering the wrapped parcels. We'll be in town for a day or two, he said casually. Perhaps we'll stop by again if we think of anything else we need. The threat was thinly veiled, but Eleanor didn't acknowledge it. Store closes at 6. Blackwood laughed, genuinely amused by her composure. You're an interesting woman, Miss Reed. Not easily rattled, are you? Life's too short for unnecessary worry, she replied evenly. That it is. Blackwood donned his hat, tipping it slightly in mock courtesy. Quinn Webb, Tate, let's not keep the lady from her work. As the 4 men moved toward the door, Blackwood paused, glancing back at the rifle. Fine piece that my father had one similar. A pause. He died with it in his hands, too slow to reload when it mattered. Eleanor met his gaze. Some men are meant to die with guns in their hands seems fitting somehow. Something dangerous flickered in Blackwood's eyes there, and gone in an instant. Then the false smile returned. Indeed it does, Miss Reed. Indeed it does. After the outlaws left, Eleanor stood motionless behind the counter, listening to their boots on the wooden sidewalk, their voices growing fainter as they moved down the street. Only when she was certain they were gone did she allow her shoulders to relax slightly. That had been closer than she'd have liked. Webb's attempt to handle her rifle had nearly pushed her too far. The instinct to defend it wasn't just about protecting a family heirloom. It was about preventing Blackwood from discovering just how well-maintained and ready for use that antique truly was. Eleanor moved to the window, watching as Blackwood and his men crossed the street toward Sullivan's saloon. The other 3 men, presumably the remaining members of the gang, were already tying their horses outside. All 7 would soon be in one place, likely gathering information, assessing the town's weaknesses, and planning their next move. The encounter had confirmed what Eleanor already suspected. These men weren't simply passing through Clearwater Basin. Was their target, though, whether for simple robbery or something more malicious, remained to be seen. Their casual confidence, the testing of boundaries, the barely concealed contempt for the law, all pointed to men who viewed the town as prey, not as a brief stop on their journey. The bell above the door jangled again, and Eleanor turned to see Sheriff Wilson entering the store. His expression was grim, his movements tense. Parker told me they were here, he said without preamble. You all right? Eleanor nodded. They bought supplies, made some thinly veiled threats. Nothing direct. No. Wilson removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. Damn it, I was checking the outlying properties when they rode in. He looked at Eleanor closely. Parker said there was some trouble with the rifle. Nothing I couldn't handle. Eleanor replied. The young one, Webb, got too curious. I discouraged him. Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly. Discouraged him, however, firmly. The sheriff sighed. Eleanor, these aren't ordinary troublemakers. They're killers, professional, cold-blooded killers. I'm aware. Eleanor's tone was matter-of-fact. Blackwood made that quite clear without saying it directly. Wilson moved closer, lowering his voice even though they were alone in the store. Listen to me. I've sent Parker to locate the nearest telegraph office that's still operating. With ours down, we need to get word to Helena or Carson City, but it'll take time for help to arrive if it comes at all. So we're on our own, Eleanor said, unsurprised. For now, Wilson's expression was troubled. They're over at Sullivan's now. I'm heading there next, trying to get a read on their intentions. Be careful. Eleanor warned. Blackwood is smarter than he looks, and the big one. Quinn, he's dangerous. Watch everything, say little. Wilson gave her a curious look. You got all that from one encounter. Eleanor didn't elaborate, simply holding his gaze until Wilson nodded slowly. I'll be careful, he promised. You should close up early today. and give them the satisfaction of knowing they've disrupted the town. Eleanor shook her head. No business as usual, that's what will unsettle them most. A town that isn't cowed by their presence? Wilson studied her for a long moment. You're not what you seem, are you, Eleanor Reed? A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. None of us are sheriff, not really. The atmosphere in Sullivan's saloon thrummed with tense energy as Joshua Blackwood and his men claimed a corner table, drinks in hand. The regular patrons kept their distance, nursing their beers with unusual focus. Conversations muted and eyes averted. Marcus Sullivan moved behind the bar with forced casualness, polishing glasses, while keeping a wary eye on the newcomers. At 48, Sullivan had transformed from a hot-headed young man seeking fortune to a respected business owner with a stake in the community's future. Blackwood lounged in his chair, seemingly at ease but missing nothing. His brother Isaac sat beside him, a leaner, sharper version of Joshua, with eyes that constantly scanned the room. Webb, Quinn, and Tate occupied the remaining chairs, while the final two gang members, brothers Jem and Levi Roth, stood nearby, keeping watch on the entrance. Interesting town, Joshua observed, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Quiet, isolated. Isaac nodded slightly. Sheriff seems green, deputies even greener. Notice that, Joshua agreed. Makes things simpler. Webb leaned against the wall, his expression sour. That storekeeper woman needs to learn some manners. Joshua's gaze sharpened. The widow Miss Reed. Yeah, Webb rubbed his wrist where Eleanor's grip had left marks. Got all high and mighty when I tried to look at that old rifle of hers. Grabbed me like she thought she could take me in a fight. Jem Roth, the older of the brothers, chuckled. Got manhandled by a shopkeeper. Did you losing your touch? Webb's face flushed with anger. She caught me by surprise, as all won't happen again. No, Joshua agreed, his voice suddenly cold. It won't, because you'll stay clear of her store unless I say otherwise. His gaze swept across his men. All of you, something's not right about that woman. Quinn nodded slowly. Moved too fast, stood too steady, wasn't afraid. Exactly. Joshua drained his glass. And people who aren't afraid either have nothing to lose or know something. We don't, either way, it bears watching. The saloon doors swung open and Sheriff Wilson entered. His stance was casual, but his hand rested near his holster. The room fell silent as he approached the Outlaws' table. Gentlemen, Wilson said, tipping his hat slightly. Welcome to Clearwater Basin. I'm Sheriff Daniel Wilson. Blackwood gestured expansively. Sheriff, join us for a drink. We were just admiring your fine town. Wilson remained standing. Appreciate the offer, but I'm on duty. Just wanted to make myself known. Let you folks know how we do things around here. And how's that? Isaac asked, his tone mildly curious, but his eyes cold. Peacefully, Wilson replied evenly. Folks mind their business, respect others' property, and everyone gets along fine. Blackwood smiled, refilling his glass from the bottle on the table. Sound philosophy, Sheriff. We're just passing through, restocking supplies before heading north. No intention of disturbing your peaceful town. Wilson nodded, his expression neutral. Glad to hear it. How long will you be staying? A day or two at most. Blackwood replied, Horses need rest, and so do we. Been a long ride. The hotel's comfortable. Wilson suggested, Mrs. Harrington runs a clean establishment. Webb smirked, drawing a sharp glance from Blackwood. We'll keep that in mind. Blackwood said smoothly, For now, we're just enjoying Mr. Sullivan's fine whiskey. Wilson's gaze swept across the 7 men, memorizing faces, assessing threats. Well then, enjoy your stay, gentlemen. If you need anything, my office is just down the street. As he turned to leave, Blackwood called after him. Sheriff, one question if you don't mind. Wilson paused. Yes. That storekeeper, Miss Reed. She's been in town a long time. Wilson's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. About 15 years, give or take. Why do you ask? Blackwood shrugged. Just curious. She seems different from the other folks we've met. Eleanor Reed's a fixture in Clearwater Basin. Wilson replied carefully. Respected businesswoman, keeps to herself mostly. A widow, she said. Wilson nodded. Her husband Robert passed away some years back. Anything else you'd like to know about our residence, Mr. Blackwood? The challenge was subtle but clear. Blackwood smiled, raising his glass slightly. Just making conversation. Sheriff getting to know the local color? After Wilson left, the Outlaws exchanged glances. He knows who we are, Isaac muttered. Of course he does, Joshua replied. Question is, what does he plan to do about it? Quinn's soft voice cut through their speculation. He's buying time. Sent the boy deputy out of town earlier, probably for help. Joshua nodded, unsurprised. Won't matter. We'll be done and gone before help arrives. He turned to Webb, his expression hardening. As for the widow Reed, you leave her be. Something doesn't sit right there, and I want to understand what it is before we make our move. Webb scowled but nodded reluctantly. Fine, but when the time comes, that rifle's mine. Always wanted a souvenir. Blackwood didn't respond, his attention already elsewhere. His gaze drifted toward the window, where he could just see the corner of Reed's trading post down the street. The widow had piqued his curiosity, a dangerous thing to do with a man like Joshua Blackwood. One way or another, he'd discover what Eleanor Reed was hiding before he and his men were done with Clearwater Basin. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Clearwater Basin, the town held its breath. Most businesses had quietly closed early, their owners retreating behind locked doors. Only 3 establishments remained open. Sullivan's Saloon, where the Blackwood gang continued to drink and observe, the sheriff's office, where Wilson maintained a watchful presence, and Reed's trading post, where Eleanor continued business as if it were any ordinary day. Inside her store, Eleanor served the few customers brave enough to venture out, noting the hushed voices and nervous glances toward the door. The Blackwood gang's presence had cast a pall over the town, a heavy weight of anticipation. Not if, but when. Not whether, but how bad. Rebecca Palmer entered just before 4 o'clock, her medical bag clutched tightly in one hand. The doctor's expression was strained, her movements precise with suppressed tension. Eleanor, she said quietly, approaching the counter. I need bandages and carbolic acid, whatever you have. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, but asked no questions as she gathered the supplies. Anything else? Rebecca hesitated. Laudanum if you have it, and whiskey the good kind. Expecting trouble, Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. Preparing for it. Rebecca's voice dropped lower. James saw 2 of Blackwood's men scouting the bank earlier. They weren't even trying to be subtle about it. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. Wilson knows, I told him. He's gathering a few men, but... Rebecca trailed off, the doubt clear in her voice. But they're not gunfighters. Eleanor finished for her. She wrapped the medical supplies in brown paper, her movements efficient and calm. How's Parker? Has he returned yet? No. Rebecca accepted the package, placing coins on the counter. The telegraph lines are still down. We're isolated, Eleanor. We've always been isolated, Eleanor replied. Distance just makes it more obvious now. Rebecca studied her friend's composed expression. You're not worried, are you? Eleanor met her gaze. Worry doesn't solve problems, Rebecca. It just clouds judgment when you need it most. There's a difference between worry and caution. Yes, Eleanor agreed. And I'm being cautious. Her hand disappeared briefly beneath the counter, a subtle reminder of the weapon hidden there. You should get back to your clinic. Be ready if you're needed. Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. What about you? Will you finally close early and show weakness? Eleanor shook her head. I close at 6, same as always. After Rebecca left, Eleanor moved to the window, observing the street through the gap in the curtains. 2 of Blackwood's men, the Roth brothers, based on their similar builds, lounged outside the bank, making no effort to disguise their interest in the building. They were sending a message establishing dominance, letting the town know they could take what they wanted when they were ready. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. Amateur tactics. Professional robbers would have maintained the pretense of innocence until the last possible moment striking, when guards were down, rather than telegraphing their intentions. This display was about fear as much as preparation, a psychological tactic to ensure compliance when the time came. The bell jangled, pulling Eleanor from her thoughts. Sheriff Wilson entered, his expression grave. You've seen them, he said without preamble. Eleanor nodded toward the window. I've seen. They're not subtle. No, they're not. Wilson removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in frustration. They want us on edge, jumping at shadows. It's working, Eleanor observed. Town's already half shut down. Wilson moved closer, his voice dropping. I've deputized Sullivan and 3 others, best I could do on short notice. They'll patrol tonight. Make sure the Blackwood gang doesn't try anything under cover of darkness. Eleanor didn't bother hiding her skepticism. 4 men with minimal experience against 7 professional killers. Those aren't encouraging odds, Daniel. Do you have a better suggestion? The sheriff's tone held an edge of frustration. Eleanor was silent for a moment, considering. The bank's their target, clearly. Clear the money out, hide it somewhere they wouldn't think to look. Already done, Wilson replied. Harrison took the cash box home after we spotted them watching the place. Not much in it anyway. Payday for the lumber mill isn't until next week. Smart. What about the saloon? Sullivan removed most of his better liquor and hid his cash box. Wilson's mouth tightened. But that's not going to satisfy men like Blackwood. If they don't find what they're looking for, they'll take something else or someone. The implication hung in the air between them. Small frontier towns had seen it before. Women taken as hostages or, worse, men executed as examples. Buildings torched in frustration or simple cruelty. I know their type, Eleanor said softly. They didn't ride all this way for a few dollars and some whiskey. They want something more. Wilson studied her face. And what would that be? Entertainment. Eleanor's voice was flat. The thrill of power. Men like Blackwood feed on fear as much as money. You seem to understand them well. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I've known their kind before. Wilson didn't press further, but his eyes held a question one Eleanor had avoided answering for 15 years. Instead, he glanced up at the Kentucky rifle above the door. Parker mentioned what happened earlier with the young one. Webb said you moved pretty quick. Eleanor's expression revealed nothing. Webb needs to learn about personal boundaries. That's not what I'm asking. Eleanor, Wilson leaned closer. If things go bad, and I'm thinking they might, I need to know who I can count on. Really count on. For a long moment, Eleanor was silent, weighing decades of careful anonymity against the growing certainty that Clearwater Basin faced a reckoning. Finally, she sighed. I can handle a gun if that's what you're asking. Wilson's expression suggested he suspected there was more to it than that, but he nodded. Good to know. Keep that Colt under your counter loaded. Eleanor's eyebrow arched slightly. You knew about that? A ghost of a smile touched Wilson's lips. Been sheriff here for 15 years. Eleanor, not much gets past me. He replaced his hat, moving toward the door. Keep your eyes open if you see anything. Anything at all that suggests they're making their move, fire a shot. The whole town will hear it. After Wilson left, Eleanor continued her work, but her senses remained heightened alert to every sound and movement from the street. Wilson had been right about one thing: the Blackwood gang hadn't come all this way for a simple robbery. Men like them wanted spectacle destruction, a story to tell in saloons across the territory, building their fearsome reputation. And Clearwater Basin, isolated and vulnerable, was the perfect stage for their performance. Dust settled over Clearwater Basin, painting the mountains in hues of violet and deep blue. Joshua Blackwood led his men from Sullivan's saloon toward the small hotel at the end of Main Street. The 7 outlaws moved with unhurried confidence, boots echoing on the wooden sidewalks, spurs jingling with each step. The few townspeople still on the street hurried to get out of their way, ducking into buildings or crossing to the opposite side. Inside the hotel lobby, Margaret Harrington straightened as the door swung open, her expression carefully neutral as the outlaws entered. At the desk beside her, Michael tensed his young face, pale but determined. Gentlemen, Margaret greeted them, her voice steady despite her 67 years. Looking for rooms. Blackwood removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Indeed, we are, ma'am, 7 of your finest, if you please. We have 4 available, Margaret replied. Some of you will need to share? Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. That'll do just fine, we're not particular. He placed coins on the counter. One night to start, might stay longer if we find the town accommodating. Margaret began the registration process, her handwriting as precise and unwavering as if she were serving ordinary travelers. Michael stood silently beside her, eyes downcast but shoulders rigid. "Boy looks nervous," Isaac Blackwood observed, leaning against the counter. "Something troubling you, son?" Michael swallowed but didn't respond. Margaret's pen paused momentarily, then continued its steady progress across the page. "My grandson doesn't mean to be rude," she said smoothly. "He's shy around strangers." "Is that so?" Joshua studied the young man with predatory interest. "Or is it something else, Sheriff Wilson, perhaps? Has he been spreading stories about us?" "We don't listen to stories," Margaret replied, pushing the registry toward Blackwood for his signature. "In Clearwater Basin, we judge people by their actions." "Adrim. Wise policy, Mrs. Harrington." Blackwood signed the book with a flourish. "Rest assured, our actions will speak for themselves before we leave your fine establishment." The threat, thinly veiled, hung in the air. As Margaret handed over the room keys, Blackwood distributed them among his men, then turned back to her. "One more thing, that trading post down the street. Reeds tell me about the owner." Margaret's expression maintained careful neutrality. "Eleanor. She's been here as long as I have, runs a good business, keeps to herself, mostly. Husband passed years ago, stray bullet during a dispute outside the saloon." Blackwood nodded, absorbing this information. "Seems like a woman of unusual capabilities." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Most women who survive out here develop capabilities. Mr. Blackwood, necessity demands it." Blackwood smiled, recognizing the subtle rebuke. "Indeed it does, Mrs. Harrington. Indeed it does." And he gestured to his men. "Get settled, boys. Meet downstairs in an hour." As the Outlaws headed upstairs, Margaret placed a hand on Michael's arm, squeezing gently to still his trembling. Only when they were out of earshot did she speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Go to Eleanor's. Tell her they've been asking questions." When Michael hesitated, she added, "Through the back, don't let them see you." At precisely 6 o'clock, Eleanor Reed locked the front door of the trading post, turned the sign to closed, and extinguished the main lanterns. To anyone watching, it appeared she was following her usual routine, but beneath the counter, a canvas bag now held essential supplies, ammunition, bandages, dried food. Preparation, not panic. She had just finished her closing inventory when a soft knock came at the back door. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. Eleanor's hand moved to the Colt at her waist before she recognized Michael Harrington's distinctive pattern. She unlocked the door, ushering the young man inside quickly. "What's happened?" Michael's words tumbled out in a rush. "They've taken rooms at the hotel. Blackwood was asking grandmother about you, specifically you, Eleanor." Eleanor's expression hardened. "What did Margaret tell him?" "Nothing important, that you've been here a long time, that you're a widow." Michael swallowed nervously. "But he seems interested. Said you had unusual capabilities." "Did he now?" Eleanor's voice was deceptively calm. "Anything else? They're meeting downstairs in an hour. Planning something, I think." Michael hesitated. "Grandmother's scared, though she won't admit it. Says they've got the look of men who enjoy causing pain." Eleanor didn't contradict this assessment. "Go back to the hotel. Keep your grandmother safe. And Michael," she held his gaze, "if trouble starts, you take Margaret and hide in the cellar. Don't try to be brave." After Michael left, Eleanor moved through the store, methodically checking windows and doors, mentally cataloging potential cover positions. Sightlines, vulnerabilities. The front windows were a weakness too exposed. The storage room at the back offered better protection with only one entrance to defend. Her fingers traced the smooth wood of the counter as she considered her options. Wilson's deputized men would be watching the streets tonight, but that was little comfort. Well-intentioned amateurs against seasoned killers were poor odds indeed. As darkness settled over Clearwater Basin, Eleanor climbed the stairs to her living quarters. The room was dim lit only by a single lantern, shadows dancing on the walls. She moved to the window. The main street lay quiet in the gathering darkness, lanterns beginning to glow in windows along its length. In the distance, she could see the lights of Sullivan's Saloon, the only building still fully awake at this hour. Eleanor's gaze drifted upward to the stars emerging in the clear Montana sky. The same stars she'd watched as a girl in Kentucky, where her father had first placed the long rifle in her small hands and taught her to respect its power. The same stars she'd followed west, with Robert full of hope for their future. The same stars that had witnessed everything she'd lost, and perhaps everything she still had left to give. As she turned from the window, her eyes fell on the old wooden chest at the foot of her bed. She knelt before it, running her fingers along the worn edges before lifting the heavy lid. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, lay her past, a past she'd packed away long ago. Eleanor unwrapped the bundle slowly, revealing a worn leather belt with holsters on each hip. The twin Colt revolvers gleamed in the lamplight, their pearl handles yellowed with age but still beautiful. Beneath them lay a stack of yellowed wanted posters, the topmost bearing an illustration of a young woman with a determined expression and a reward of $500 for her capture. She touched the paper, gently tracing the outline of a face she barely recognized anymore. Long before she was Eleanor Reed, shopkeeper's wife and widow of Clearwater Basin, she had been someone else entirely. Someone even the Blackwood gang would have thought twice about crossing. She rewrapped the guns and posters, returning them to the chest. No need for those, yet. The rifle would be enough if it came to that. It always had been night-wrapped. Clearwater Basin in shadows, the moon casting silver light across the wooden buildings. At the hotel, the Blackwood gang had reconvened in the small dining room, their voices low as they finalized their plans. "Tomorrow morning we move," Joshua Blackwood said, leaning forward. "First the bank. Not much there, based on what we've seen, but enough to make it worth our while. Then the saloon's cash box. After that, we make our statement." The other men nodded, understanding the implication. The Blackwood gang didn't just rob, they destroyed. Their reputation depended on leaving a trail of fear and devastation that would be remembered long after they'd moved on. "What about the sheriff?" Isaac asked. Joshua smiled coldly. "Wilson's careful, professional, but outnumbered and outgunned. We'll deal with him first. Make an example." He glanced toward the dining room entrance, where Sullivan was pointedly not looking their way. "Then his deputies, such as they are, and the widow," Webb asked, his expression darkening. Joshua's eyes narrowed. "I told you to leave her alone." "Why?" Webb challenged, emboldened by whiskey and frustration. "She's just a shopkeeper with an antique rifle. Probably doesn't even know how to use it." Quinn's soft voice cut through the tension. "She knows." All eyes turned to the large man, who rarely spoke unless he had something important to say. "What makes you say that?" Joshua asked, genuinely curious. Quinn met his gaze steadily. "The way she stands, the way she watches, the way she grabbed the boy." He nodded toward Webb. "Not a shopkeeper's move, a fighter's move." Joshua considered this, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. "Maybe, or maybe you're seeing ghosts where there aren't any." But Quinn wasn't convinced. "I've seen something feels like recognition." "Recognition?" Isaac frowned. "You know her from somewhere." Quinn shook his head. "Not her specifically, her kind." Joshua studied his lieutenant thoughtfully. Quinn had been with him the longest, and his instincts had saved them more than once. If he sensed something unusual about the widow Reed, it was worth investigating. "Tell you what," Joshua said, finally. "After we've dealt with the sheriff, Webb can pay the widow a visit, see if there's more to her than meets the eye." He fixed the young outlaw with a hard stare. "But you follow my lead, understand? No going off half-cocked." Webb nodded reluctantly. "Yes, boss." "Good." Joshua drained his glass, setting it down with a decisive thud. "Get some rest, boys, tomorrow. Clearwater Basin learns why they should have feared the day we rode into town." As the outlaws dispersed to their assigned positions for the night, Joshua remained at the table, his mind turning over Quinn's observations. The widow Reed was an anomaly, a woman alone on the frontier, running a business, facing down threats without visible fear. Such women existed, of course, forged by the harsh realities of frontier life. But there had been something in her eyes when she'd faced Webb, not just courage but confidence, the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. Joshua's instincts, honed by years of survival in a violent world, whispered a warning the widow Reed might be more than she appeared, and in his experience, surprises were rarely pleasant. Across town in the small house attached to her clinic, Rebecca Palmer sat with her husband James at their kitchen table. A single lamp cast warm light over the worn wooden surface, its flame flickering slightly in the draft from the ill-fitting window. James cleaned his shotgun with methodical precision, a task that seemed to calm his nerves even as it prepared him for the possibility of violence. "You've been quiet since you returned from Eleanor's," he observed, not looking up from his work. Rebecca's hands curled around her coffee cup, seeking its warmth. "She's not afraid, James. Not even slightly. Eleanor's always been stoic. This is different," Rebecca argued softly. "It's like she's been here before, faced men like these. I mean," James set down his cleaning cloth, adjusting his spectacles. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I don't know." Rebecca's gaze drifted to the window, where moonlight silvered the empty street. "But I've noticed things over the years. The way she's always aware of exits and entrances, how she positions herself in a room, always with her back to a wall, always with a clear view of everyone." "Habits," James suggested. "After losing Robert the way she did." "No." Rebecca shook her head. "These aren't habits born of loss. They're older, more ingrained. She hesitated once when I was treating a cut on her arm. I noticed other scars. Old ones, long healed. They look like bullet grazes." James frowned, silent for a moment before speaking again. "Everyone has secrets, especially out here. Maybe Eleanor's past is simply more complicated than we realized." "Maybe," Rebecca agreed. "But I can't help thinking that those complications might be exactly what Clearwater Basin needs right now." At the sheriff's office, Daniel Wilson sat at his desk, a map of the town spread before him. He marked positions with small wooden pieces, places where his makeshift deputies would patrol through the night, locations where the Blackwood gang had been spotted throughout the day. He wasn't fooling himself. 4 inexperienced men against 7 hardened killers weren't odds any sane person would bet on. Even with the element of surprise, which they likely wouldn't have, the best they could hope for was to slow the gang down, buy time for reinforcements that might never arrive. Wilson's thoughts drifted to Eleanor Reed. Her demeanor today, her calmness in the face of danger, her quick reflexes with Webb all pointed to someone with experience beyond running a trading post. He'd always suspected there was more to Eleanor than she revealed, but he'd respected her privacy, figuring everyone had a right to reinvent themselves out here on the frontier. Now, with danger pressing in from all sides, Wilson found himself hoping that Eleanor's past, whatever it might be, included skills that could help them survive the coming day. The jingle of spurs pulled him from his thoughts. Through the window he watched as Tate and one of the Roth brothers crossed the street heading back toward the hotel. Their posture was relaxed, confident men who believed themselves to be the most dangerous predators for 100 miles in any direction. Wilson's hand drifted to the revolver at his hip. Maybe they were right, but even the most dangerous predators could be surprised. Dawn painted the eastern sky in strokes of crimson and gold. Eleanor had been awake for hours watching the night fade from her window, the Kentucky rifle close at hand. She'd slept little, her mind cycling through possibilities, strategies, contingencies. By the time the first rays of sunlight touched the eastern peaks, she had settled on her course of action. She moved quietly through her morning routine, washing, dressing, brewing coffee stronger than usual. The rifle felt natural in her hands after all these years, like greeting an old friend. Eleanor had thought those days behind her forever, yet here she was, preparing once more for violence. Downstairs, she unlocked the back door of the trading post, but left the front entrance closed, the closed sign still in place. Breaking routine would alert Blackwood and his men that something had changed. Better to maintain appearances while preparing for what was to come. Eleanor positioned herself by the front window curtains, drawn just enough to allow her to observe the street without being seen. The town was beginning to stir, though many doors remained locked, windows shuttered. Wilson's deputies, Sullivan among them, had maintained their patrols through the night, but now looked haggard, shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Movement at the hotel caught her attention. 4 figures emerged, Webb, Quinn, and the Roth brothers, moving with purpose toward the bank. Behind them came Tate rifle slung casually over his shoulder, his young face eager for the day's violence. They made no attempt to disguise their intentions now. The time for pretense had passed. Eleanor's gaze shifted to the sheriff's office, where lights burned despite the growing dawn. Wilson would be making his preparations, such as they were a good man, she thought, but outmatched in this particular fight. She checked her weapons one final time. Both Colts fully loaded, the Kentucky rifle primed and ready. Then she waited, patient as a mountain lion watching its prey. The waiting ended sooner than expected. A gunshot shattered the morning quiet, followed by a shout, and then another shot. Eleanor tensed eyes scanning the street. The sound had come from the direction of the sheriff's office. She watched as people who had ventured out scattered for cover, ducking into doorways or fleeing back to their homes. More gunfire erupted, a rapid exchange, then silence. Moments later, 3 figures emerged from the sheriff's office. Even at a distance, Eleanor recognized Joshua Blackwood's distinctive stance, the red bandana around his neck visible in the morning light. Beside him walked Isaac, dragging someone. Eleanor's breath caught as she realized they were dragging Deputy Parker by his collar. The young man's face bloodied, his body limp. Blackwood pulled him into the middle of the street, then with casual brutality kicked him onto his back. Parker wasn't dead. Eleanor could see him struggling weakly, trying to rise. Blackwood placed a boot on his chest, pinning him to the ground. Then with theatrical deliberation, he fired a single shot into the air. "People of Clearwater Basin," Manana, Blackwood called, his voice carrying in the morning stillness. "Your attention, please." Doors cracked open slightly. Curtains twitched at windows. The town was watching, hidden but attentive. "My name is Joshua Blackwood." He continued, scanning the buildings as if he could see through walls to the frightened occupants within. "My men and I have business here today. Simple business that needn't concern most of you." He gestured to Parker, still pinned beneath his boot. "Your deputy here made the unfortunate decision to interfere with that business, as did your sheriff." Eleanor's fingers tightened on her rifle. "Wilson? Where was Wilson?" As if in answer to her unspoken question, Quinn emerged from the sheriff's office, half carrying, half dragging Sheriff Wilson. The lawman was conscious but clearly injured, blood staining his left side. "Now," Blackwood continued, "we're reasonable men. We understand you're a small community just trying to get by. So here's what's going to happen. We'll conduct our business at the bank. No one interferes, no one else gets hurt, then we'll be on our way." He paused, letting his words settle. "However, should anyone else decide to play the hero..." Blackwood aimed his revolver at Parker's head. The deputy's eyes widened in terror. "No!" The cry came from down the street. Dr. Rebecca Palmer had emerged from her clinic, medical bag in hand. "Please don't!" Blackwood turned, his expression one of mock surprise. "Well, now what have we here?" a concerned citizen. Rebecca stood her ground, though her voice trembled slightly. "He needs medical attention. Let me help him." "Does he now?" Blackwood pretended to consider this. "Perhaps you're right, doctor. The boy does look a bit worse for wear." Eleanor tensed, recognizing the false reasonableness in Blackwood's tone. He was enjoying this, the power, the fear, the control. This wasn't just about money. It was about breaking the town's spirit. Blackwood removed his boot from Parker's chest, taking a step back. "By all means, doctor, attend to your patient." Rebecca moved cautiously forward, eyes fixed on Parker. She knelt beside him, opening her medical bag. "Easy now," she murmured, checking his injuries. "You're going to be all right." Blackwood watched this tableau with apparent amusement, then glanced toward Wilson, still held upright by Quinn. "What do you think, Sheriff? Is the deputy going to be all right?" Wilson's face was pale with pain and anger, but his voice remained steady. "You won't get away with this, Blackwood." "I believe I already have." Blackwood turned back to Rebecca. "How's our patient, doctor?" "He needs proper care," Rebecca replied, her voice stronger now that she was focused on her work. "I need to get him to my clinic. All in good time." Blackwood's gaze swept the street, settling on the trading post. "But first, I believe we're missing someone from our little gathering. Where's the widow Reed?" Eleanor remained motionless behind her curtain, watching the scene unfold. Blackwood was trying to draw her out, but why? What had prompted this specific interest in her, Luke Blackwood called to Webb, "Why don't you fetch Miss Reed? I'm sure she'd hate to miss all the excitement." The young outlaw grinned clearly, eager for the assignment. "With pleasure, boss." Eleanor made her decision in an instant, better to confront them on her terms than be dragged into the street. She moved swiftly to the front door, unlocking it quietly, then stepped back, rifle in hand, positioning herself where she'd have a clear line of sight. Webb approached the trading post, revolver, drawn, cockiness evident in every step. He reached the door, trying the handle and finding it unlocked. His grin widened as he pushed it open. "Come on out, widow woman," he called. "Boss wants a word with you." Silence greeted him. The store's interior lay in shadows, the main lanterns unlit. Webb hesitated at the threshold, suddenly wary. "Don't make this difficult. I ain't asking twice." Still nothing. He took a tentative step inside. Gun raised. "I know you're in here. Your Kentucky piece of junk won't save you now." The muzzle of Eleanor's rifle pressed against the back of his head, cold and unmistakable. She had circled behind him through the storage room, approaching silently from his blind spot. "That piece of junk isn't what you should be worried about," Eleanor said quietly. Webb froze, his breath catching. "You wouldn't dare." "Blackwood would what?" Eleanor's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Kill me. Seems like that's the plan anyway." Webb swallowed hard. "Look, just come outside, that's all. No one has to get hurt." "Someone always gets hurt," Eleanor replied. "That's how men like you operate." She pressed the rifle harder against his skull. "Drop the gun." Slowly. Webb hesitated, weighing his options. Then reluctantly he lowered his revolver, letting it clatter to the floor. "Kick it away," Eleanor instructed. He complied, the gun skidding across the wooden floor into the shadows. "Now walk out the door. Hands where everyone can see them." With the rifle at his back, Webb had no choice but to obey. He moved forward, stepping onto the porch with his hands raised. "Boss!" He called, his voice higher than normal. "We've got a situation here." Blackwood turned, his expression changing from amusement to surprise as he saw Webb standing there, hands up. Then his eyes narrowed as Eleanor emerged behind him, the Kentucky rifle now aimed steadily at Blackwood himself. The street fell silent. Wilson, despite his injuries, straightened slightly at the sight. Rebecca paused in her ministrations to Parker, her eyes widening from the saloon doorway. Marcus Sullivan watched with a mixture of astonishment and newfound respect. "Well now," Blackwood said, finally recovering his composure. "Miss Reed, I was hoping you'd join us." Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on him, the rifle unwavering. "Let them go, Blackwood. The sheriff and the deputy. Let the doctor take them to her clinic." Blackwood spread his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. "And why would I do that?" "Because until you do, your boy Webb here is in a very precarious position." Eleanor's voice carried clearly in the morning air. "And because this piece of junk, rank as he called it, has never missed a shot in my hands." Blackwood studied her for a long moment, assessing this unexpected development. The widow's stance, her confidence, the steady way she held the rifle all confirmed Quinn's suspicions. This was no ordinary shopkeeper. "Interesting proposition," Blackwood said finally. "But I think you're outnumbered, Miss Reed, even with your impressive abilities." "Perhaps," Eleanor didn't blink, "but you'll be the first to die, I guarantee it." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty, the cold promise, gave Blackwood pause. His eyes narrowed as he truly looked at her, seeing past the shopkeeper's facade to something else entirely. Recognition flickered across his face. "I know you," he said slowly. "Or of you, at least." Eleanor remained silent, but something shifted in her expression, a minute tightening around the eyes. Nothing more. Blackwood's mouth curved into a smile of genuine surprise. "Well, I'll be damned, steady hand. Hayes thought you were dead." A murmur ran through the onlookers. Wilson's head snapped up, his pained expression giving way to shock. Rebecca gasped softly. Eleanor didn't confirm or deny the accusation, but her silence was enough. Blackwood laughed, a sound without humor. "The famous steady hand, Hayes, hiding all these years as a shopkeeper in a backwater mining town. Now that's a story worth telling." His expression hardened. "What changed? Have you become a defender of the innocent?" I'm defending my home, Eleanor replied evenly. Nothing more, nothing less. Blackwood seemed to consider this, then nodded almost imperceptibly. Quinn, he called, let the sheriff go. Doctor, you may take your patients. Quinn released his grip on Wilson, who staggered but remained upright through sheer force of will. Rebecca quickly moved to support him, helping him to where Parker lay. This changes nothing, you understand. Blackwood continued, his eyes locked with Eleanor's. We still have business here. The only question is whether you're going to be smart enough to stay out of our way. Eleanor's rifle remained trained on him and Webb. Blackwood, she warned, a fair trade. Blackwood declared, the sheriff and deputy for my man. When they're safely inside the clinic, Eleanor counted. Blackwood nodded, gesturing for Rebecca to proceed. She helped Wilson to his feet, then with Sullivan rushing forward to assist. They managed to get Parker up as well. The three made their way slowly toward the doctor's clinic, Sullivan supporting Parker, while Wilson limped alongside, clutching his wounded side. Eleanor watched their progress from the corner of her eye, never letting her main focus stray from Blackwood. Only when they had disappeared inside the clinic did she lower the rifle slightly. Now release Webb, Blackwood demanded. Eleanor gave the young outlaw a light push forward. Go and next time show some respect for other people's property. Webb stumbled away from her, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. He retrieved his gun from where Tate had recovered it from inside the store, then moved to Blackwood's side, glaring at Eleanor with undisguised hatred. You'll regret that, he muttered. I doubt it, Eleanor replied calmly. Blackwood placed a restraining hand on Webb's arm. Not now. His gaze remained fixed on Eleanor. So steady hand. Hayes, I remember the stories. They say you never missed a shot could hit a playing card edge on at 50 paces. His mouth curved in a mocking smile. They also say you turned on your own gang shot, Pharaoh in the back. Face to face, Eleanor corrected her first acknowledgement of her true identity. I've never shot anyone in the back. A matter of honor, is it? Blackwood seemed genuinely amused. And here you are 20 years later, still clinging to principles? He shook his head. You could have been famous, could have had your own gang, your own legend. I chose a different path. So you did. Blackwood gestured expansively at the trading post behind her. All this a quiet life in a quiet town. And now look, it's all coming apart anyway. His expression hardened. Retry Claude hit the max length for a message and has paused its response. You can write, continue to keep the chat going, and continue edit. I'll continue the story, where we left off, maintaining the cinematic narrative style and following the storytelling formula. You can't escape what you are. Steady hand. Blackwood continued, his voice carrying across the tense street. No matter how long you hide, Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. I'm not hiding anymore. A tense silence fell over the street as the two faced off, each measuring the other. Then Blackwood nodded as if coming to a decision. Boys, he called to his men, we've got a change of plans. Leave the bank for now. Miss Hayes here deserves our full attention. The Roth brothers exchanged glances, clearly confused by this shift in strategy. Quinn, however, nodded slightly, understanding his leader's thinking. You've made this personal, Eleanor observed. Blackwood smiled coldly. You made it personal when you decided to interfere. He spread his hands. But I'm a reasonable man. One last chance to step aside. Let us take what we came for, and we'll leave this dusty little town in peace. We both know that's not true, Eleanor replied. You've never left anything in peace. Perhaps not. Blackwood's hand hovered near his holster. So what now? Steady hand. A shooting contest, you against my entire gang. If that's what it takes. A whisper of movement from the hotel caught her attention. Michael Harrington stood in the doorway, a rifle clutched in his inexperienced hands. Behind him, Margaret watched with a mixture of terror and determination. Other townspeople had emerged as well. James Palmer with a shotgun, Harrison Wells with an ancient pistol, even old Hank Tolliver with a wood-cutting axe. Blackwood noticed the gathering crowd and laughed. Look at that! The town's found its courage. He turned back to Eleanor. Thanks to you, I imagine their very own legendary gunslinger comes out of retirement to save them. They don't need me to save them, Eleanor replied. They just needed someone to stand up first. Blackwood's amusement faded, replaced by cold calculation. 7 professional killers against a retired outlaw and a handful of frightened townspeople. The odds still favored him heavily, but Eleanor Hayes's reputation wasn't built on myth alone. If even half the stories were true, she was dangerous in ways few living people could claim to be. I'm offering you one last chance, Blackwood said, his voice hardening, because I respect your reputation. Take these civilians and get out of the way. We'll do our business and be gone before sundown. Eleanor shook her head. Can't do that, Blackwood. For a moment the street hung suspended in tense silence. Then Blackwood sighed as if genuinely regretful. Have it your way then. His hand dropped to his holster with blinding speed, drawing and firing in one fluid motion. But Eleanor had anticipated the move. She dove to the side, rolling behind a water trough, as the bullet splintered the wood where she had stood. The peaceful morning erupted into chaos as Blackwood's men opened fire. Bullets thudded into the trading post's wooden facade. Eleanor returned fire from behind the trough, her first shot catching Jem Roth in the shoulder, spinning him around with a cry of pain. Townspeople scattered, some running for cover, others raising their own weapons in a ragged defense. Michael fired from the hotel doorway, his shot going wide but forcing Webb to dive for cover. James Palmer's shotgun boomed the scattered pellets, keeping Isaac Blackwood pinned behind a rain barrel. Eleanor reloaded the Kentucky rifle with practiced efficiency movements so ingrained they required no conscious thought. 15 years melted away in an instant. She was steady hand. Hayes once more, her senses sharpened to a razor's edge by the familiar rush of combat. A bullet winged past her ear, too close for comfort. Webb had worked his way to a better position, his youthful pride driving him to target the woman who had humiliated him. Eleanor answered with a shot from one of her Colts, the bullet shattering a window frame inches from the young outlaw's head. You can't win this, steady hand, Blackwood shouted from his position behind an overturned wagon. Not even you can take down all of us? Eleanor didn't waste breath responding. Instead, she used the moment to gauge positions. Blackwood behind the wagon, Isaac pinned by Palmer's sporadic shotgun blasts, Jem Roth wounded his brother Levi, firing from the bank's doorway, Webb trying to flank her from the left, Tate providing covering fire from behind a horse trough, and Quinn, where was Quinn? The realization came too late. A shadow fell across her as the large man appeared, seemingly from nowhere, having circled behind the buildings to approach from her blind spot. Before Eleanor could swing her rifle around Quinn's boot, connected with her hand, sending the weapon skittering across the dirt, Eleanor rolled away from a second kick, drawing both Colts in one smooth motion. Quinn was fast for his size, already adjusting his attack, a knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. They faced each other in a standoff, mere feet apart. Nothing personal. Quinn rumbled, his voice as quiet as ever, despite the chaos around them. Never is, Eleanor replied. Colt's unwavering, Quinn's eyes held a strange respect. Heard stories about you. Never thought I'd see if they were true. Guess today is your lucky day. A hint of a smile touched the big man's lips. We'll see about that. He lunged forward, knife flashing in the morning light. Eleanor fired, but Quinn had anticipated it, twisting his body so the bullet merely grazed his side. His massive form slammed into her, driving her backward. They crashed to the ground, Eleanor's breath leaving her lungs in a painful rush. Quinn raised the knife, his weight pinning her down. Eleanor brought her knee up sharply, connecting with his midsection. He grunted, but didn't release his grip. The knife descended, a gunshot cracked through the air. Quinn froze, a look of surprise crossing his weathered features. A bloom of red spread across his chest, directly over his heart. He looked down at it almost curiously, then back at Eleanor. Guess not my lucky day after all, he managed before toppling sideways onto the dirt. Eleanor scrambled to her feet, turning to see Sheriff Wilson leaning against the clinic doorway, his smoking revolver still raised despite the obvious pain it cost him to stand. Their eyes met across the street, acknowledgement, respect, a shared understanding of what had to be done. The brief moment of connection shattered as Blackwood's enraged voice rose above the gunfire. Quinn, The gang leader's face contorted with genuine grief and fury as he saw his lieutenant lying motionless in the dirt. "You'll pay for that, all of you." His previous calculation gave way to blind rage. Blackwood broke cover, firing wildly as he charged toward Eleanor. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet as she dove for the Kentucky rifle, rolling to a firing position in one fluid motion. Time seemed to slow. Blackwood's face twisted with hate and loss. His finger tightening on the trigger, the red bandana at his throat bright as blood in the morning sun. Eleanor exhaled slowly, just as her father had taught her decades ago on a Kentucky hillside center. "Your target squeeze, don't pull," the ancient rifle roared. Through the haze of smoke, Eleanor saw Blackwood stagger, a look of profound disbelief crossing his features as he registered the bullet hole precisely centered in his chest. His revolver slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, thudding into the dirt. "Impossible," he whispered, sinking to his knees. "Never misses." Eleanor finished for him, rising slowly to her feet. "Not in my hands." Blackwood's eyes held hers for a moment longer, rage giving way to a strange acceptance. Then he pitched forward onto the street, dust rising around him like a shroud. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fallen, lost whatever resolve had driven them. Isaac Blackwood, now wounded himself from Palmer's shotgun, raised his hands in surrender. The Roth brothers followed suit. Only Webb continued to fire wildly, screaming obscenities until a bullet from Michael Harrington's rifle, a lucky shot from the inexperienced young man, caught him in the leg, ending his resistance. As suddenly as it had begun, the gunfight was over. The morning air moments ago filled with gunfire and shouts fell eerily silent. Smoke drifted across the street, the smell of gunpowder sharp and acrid. Eleanor stood amid the chaos, the Kentucky rifle still warm in her hands, her breathing steady despite the exertion. She surveyed the aftermath, 2 of Blackwood's gang dead, the others wounded or surrendered. Among the townspeople there were injuries, but miraculously no fatalities. Wilson limped toward her, clutching his wounded side. "Never misses, huh?" he said, nodding toward the rifle. Eleanor met his gaze. "Not when it matters." Around them, the town of Clearwater Basin stirred to life once more. Rebecca emerged from her clinic, already directing people to bring the wounded inside Sullivan, and Harrison began securing the surviving outlaws. Margaret Harrington wrapped a protective arm around her grandson, pride and relief mingling in her weathered face. Wilson's eyes held a question as he looked at Eleanor. "Steady hand, Hayes," he said quietly. "All these years." Eleanor nodded once, acknowledging the truth that could no longer be hidden. "All these years. What happens now?" Wilson asked, his tone suggesting the question encompassed more than just the immediate aftermath. Eleanor looked around at the town she had called home for 15 years, the people she had lived alongside, the life she had built. Her secret was out, her past revealed. Would they see her differently now? Would she be forced to move on once again, start over somewhere new, as if in answer to her unspoken questions? Margaret Harrington approached her, chin held high. "Miss Hayes," she said formally. Then her expression softened. "Eleanor, thank you." One by one, the townspeople gathered around her, offering nods of respect, quiet words of gratitude, not fear or judgment, but acceptance. "Seems to me," Wilson said, observing this, "that Clearwater Basin still needs its trading post, and its trading post still needs its owner, whatever name she goes by." Eleanor felt something tight within her chest begin to loosen, a tension she had carried for 15 years, finally releasing its grip. The Kentucky rifle, her father's legacy, felt right in her hands once more. Not as a tool of violence, but as a symbol of protection of home. "Eleanor Reed suits me just fine," she said at last. "Always has." The point of no return had arrived and passed. Clearwater Basin would never be the same, but perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing after all. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Clearwater Basin as the town slowly recovered from the morning's violence. The bodies of Joshua Blackwood and Quinn had been moved to the undertakers, their final resting places, to be unmarked graves on the hillside. The surviving members of the gang, Isaac Blackwood, The Roth brothers, Webb and Tate, were locked in the sheriff's makeshift cells awaiting transport to the territorial prison, once reinforcements arrived from Helena. Inside Dr. Palmer's clinic, Rebecca moved from patient to patient, her skilled hands treating wounds with quiet efficiency. Wilson sat on the edge of an examination table, grimacing as she changed the bandage on his side. "You're lucky," she told him, inspecting the wound. "The bullet passed clean through another inch to the right, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Wilson managed a wry smile. "Seems luck was with a lot of us today." Rebecca glanced toward the other room, where Parker lay sleeping, his injuries serious but no longer life-threatening. "Not all of this was luck, Sheriff." She secured the fresh bandage and stepped back. "Some of it was having the right person in the right place at the right time." Wilson nodded, his thoughts turning to Eleanor. No Eleanor Hayes. The revelation of her true identity still struck him as impossible. Yet in retrospect, the signs had always been there. The way she moved, the careful way she observed everything, her unnatural calm in the face of danger. Steady hand. "Hayes," he murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. "All this time?" "I've heard stories about her since I was a girl back east," Rebecca said as she wiped her hands on a clean cloth. "Never imagined I'd be treating patients alongside a living legend." "She's not just a legend, Rebecca," Wilson said. "She's our neighbor, has been for 15 years. "Question is what happens now?" Rebecca asked, putting her medical supplies away. "That depends on how the town reacts, and on Eleanor herself." Wilson carefully buttoned his shirt, wincing at the movement. "She saved a lot of lives today, mine included." "Yes," Rebecca agreed, "but people fear what they don't understand. And a former outlaw living in their midst, that's going to take some getting used to." Wilson stood carefully, testing his balance. "Then I suppose we'd better help them understand." At the trading post, Eleanor stood behind the counter, methodically repairing the damage from the morning's gunfight. Bullets had splintered the wooden shelves and shattered several windows. Merchandise lay scattered across the floor, some of it beyond salvaging. The Kentucky rifle had been returned to its place of honor, above the door, cleaned and oiled after performing its duty. The Colts were back in her chest upstairs, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden away once more, though Eleanor suspected such secrecy was pointless now. The bell above the door jangled as Marcus Sullivan entered, carrying a wooden toolbox. His face showed the weariness of the day, but his eyes held new respect as he looked at Eleanor. "Thought you might need some help with those windows," he said, setting down the toolbox. "Got some spare glass at the saloon." Eleanor paused in her work. "Thank you, Marcus, wasn't necessary." Sullivan shrugged. "Seemed like the least I could do, considering." He glanced around at the damage. "Place took quite a beating. Nothing that can't be fixed." Eleanor resumed sweeping shattered glass into a pile. Sullivan watched her for a moment, then cleared his throat. "So steady hand, Hayes." Eleanor didn't look up. "Eleanor Reed will do just fine." "Right." Sullivan nodded, then began removing the broken glass from one of the window frames. They worked in silence for a while, each focused on their task. Finally, Sullivan spoke again. "My father used to tell stories about the Faro gang. Said they were the smartest outfit in 3 states, hit banks like ghosts in and out before anyone knew what happened." Eleanor said nothing, but her hands stilled slightly. "Also said they never killed unless they had to," Sullivan continued. "Until that last job in Missouri, story goes that Faro lost his mind, was going to execute the hostages, but his best shot turned on him, put a bullet right between his eyes." Sullivan looked up from his work. "Saved a dozen lives that day, including a 10-year-old boy." Eleanor met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "That boy was my cousin." Sullivan said quietly, "His father was the bank manager in Westfield. So forgive me if I put some stock in that particular story." Eleanor absorbed this information, the implications settling over her like a physical weight. For 15 years, she had believed her past actions had been buried, forgotten by all but a few. Now she was confronted with the reality that her choices had rippled outward, touching lives she had never known. "I didn't know," she said finally. Sullivan nodded. "No reason you would have. Point is, before today, I thought Steadyhand Hayes was probably dead somewhere. A lot of people did. but knowing you've been here all along, living a quiet life, running an honest business." He gestured around the trading post. "Well, that changes things. Makes me think people can really start over." Eleanor considered his words. "It's not always that simple. Nothing worth doing ever is." Sullivan held up the new glass pane. "Mind giving me a hand with this?" As they worked together to repair the window, Eleanor found herself thinking about the strange turns life took. 15 years ago, she couldn't have imagined standing shoulder to shoulder with the saloon owner, discussing her past without fear or shame. 15 years ago, she had been running her only thought to put as much distance as possible between herself and the life she was leaving behind. Now somehow she had come full circle. The past had caught up with her. Yet instead of destroying the life she had built, it had revealed connections she never knew existed. The bell jangled again as Margaret Harrington entered, followed by her grandson Michael. The young man's arm was bandaged where a bullet had grazed him during the fight, but he stood tall, meeting Eleanor's gaze with newfound confidence. "Eleanor," Margaret said, her tone formal yet warm, "the town council has called an emergency meeting. They've asked for you to attend." Eleanor stiffened slightly. "The council?" "Yes." Margaret's expression gave nothing away. 7 o'clock at the church. Sullivan paused in his work, glancing between the two women. "What's this about, Margaret?" The older woman shrugged. "Official town business, that's all I know." She turned to leave, then paused. "You should come too. Marcus is a business owner." After they left, Sullivan gave Eleanor a questioning look. "Town council doesn't usually meet unless there's something important to discuss. Like what to do with an infamous outlaw in their midst." Eleanor said, her voice dry. Sullivan frowned. "That's not fair. You've been here 15 years. You're as much a part of this town as anyone. People's memories get selective when they're afraid." Eleanor set down her broom. "And today gave them plenty of reasons to be afraid. You saved this town, Eleanor. They know that. Or do they?" She shook her head. "Or do they see Steady-Hand Hayes, the outlaw with a price on her head? The woman who rode with the Pharaoh gang?" Sullivan had no immediate answer for that. Finally he said, "Guess we'll find out at 7. The old church building had been restored after the fire 3 years ago, though it still bore scars of the blaze. Blackened beams were visible in the ceiling, and the replacement pews didn't quite match the few originals that had been salvaged. But it served its purpose as both a place of worship and the town's meeting hall. By 6:45, it was nearly full. Word of the emergency council meeting had spread quickly, and it seemed most of Clearwater Basin's residents had decided to attend. They sat in family groups, voices hushed as they discussed the day's events, glancing periodically toward the door. Sheriff Wilson arrived early, moving stiffly, but under his own power. Rebecca accompanied him, insisting he take one of the front pews to avoid standing. Sullivan was there too, freshly washed and wearing his good coat, a sign of the meeting's importance. Gradually, the other business owners filed in: Harrison, from the post office; Palmer from the school; Margaret Harrington, representing the hotel. At precisely 7 o'clock, Eleanor Reed entered. The church fell silent as she walked down the center aisle. Her steps measured and unhurried. She had changed into a clean dress, her auburn hair neatly braided, but the gun belt at her hips broke with propriety. The twin Colts gleamed in the lantern light, a clear statement that while she was willing to face the town's judgment, she would do so on her own terms. She took a seat in the last row, her back to the wall, a position that gave her a clear view of both exits and every person in the room. Old habits. Mayor Thomas Fletcher, a portly man who ran the town's only feed store, called the meeting to order. At 65, Fletcher had been mayor for over a decade, more by default than ambition. He cleared his throat nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the unusual circumstances. "Friends and neighbors," he began, "we find ourselves in an extraordinary situation today. Our town faced a threat unlike any in recent memory. The Blackwood gang came to Clearwater Basin with the intention of robbery, and I think we can all agree worse." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the church. Thanks to the bravery of Sheriff Wilson, Deputy Parker, and others who stood against them, that threat has been neutralized. Fletcher dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief. But the day's events have also brought to light certain revelations about one of our own. All eyes turned toward Eleanor. For 15 years, Fletcher continued, Eleanor Reed has run the trading post, serving this community with honesty and diligence. Many of us, myself included, considered her a friend, a neighbor, a valued member of Clearwater Basin. Eleanor's expression remained impassive, though she noted his use of the past tense. Today we learned that, before she came here, Eleanor Reed was known by another name, Steady Hand Hayes, a member of the notorious Pharaoh Gang. Fletcher's voice shook slightly, a wanted outlaw with a price on her head. The church erupted in whispers and exclamations. Fletcher raised his hands for quiet. The town council has convened this meeting to decide how to proceed. This is a matter that affects us all, and all voices should be heard. He adjusted his spectacles nervously. Sheriff Wilson has requested to speak first. Wilson rose slowly, favoring his injured side. He surveyed the crowded church before speaking, his voice steady and assured. Most of you know, I came to law enforcement late in life. Before I pinned on a badge, I rode with the Texas Rangers for 12 years. He paused, letting this previously unshared information sink in. In that time, I hunted men like Joshua Blackwood across 3 states. I've seen what real outlaws can do to a town. He turned slightly, meeting Eleanor's gaze across the room. Eleanor Reed, or Eleanor Hayes if you prefer, is not that kind of outlaw. Never was. The Pharaoh Gang were bank robbers, yes, but they had a code: no killing unless absolutely necessary, no harming women or children, no excessive violence. Wilson shifted his weight, wincing slightly. But more importantly, when Pharaoh himself broke that code, when he decided to execute hostages during their last job, it was Eleanor who stopped him. She turned on her own gang leader, shot him dead, saving those hostages at the cost of everything she had built. The church was silent now, every person hanging on Wilson's words. That woman sitting there, he pointed to Eleanor, could have let Blackwood and his men rob us blind today, could have stayed hidden in her store, protected herself and no one else. Instead, she stood up, put herself between killers. And this town used skills she'd kept hidden for 15 years to save lives that, frankly, some of us didn't do enough to protect. Wilson's gaze swept the assembled townspeople, many of whom looked away, uncomfortable with this blunt assessment. Now you want to sit in judgment? His voice hardened. Fine, judge her by what she did today. Judge her by 15 years of honest living. Judge her by the lives she saved, including mine. He sat down carefully. That's all I have to say. Mayor, Fletcher cleared his throat. Thank you, Sheriff. Does anyone else wish to speak? To everyone's surprise, Michael Harrington stood. The young man's face flushed as all eyes turned to him, but he squared his shoulders. I've lived in Clearwater Basin my whole life. He began, his voice initially uncertain, but growing stronger. Never been anywhere else. Always thought it was well boring, to be honest. A few chuckles greeted this admission. Always dreamed of having adventures somewhere else. Michael turned toward Eleanor. Today I fired a gun in anger for the first time. Hit one of Blackwood's men, scared me half to death. He took a deep breath. But I did it because I saw Miss Reed, Miss Hayes, standing her ground. Not running, not hiding, fighting for our town, our home. He looked around the church. If she can do that, someone who came from somewhere else, who chose us, then how can we turn our backs on her now? Margaret Harrington beamed at her grandson with undisguised pride. One by one, others rose to speak. Marcus Sullivan recounted the story of his cousin saved during the Westfield bank robbery. Rebecca Palmer spoke of Eleanor's calm competence during crises, how she had always been the first to help when medical emergencies arose. Even James Palmer, normally reticent, described how Eleanor had taught several of the older school children basic wilderness survival skills during the previous winter. As the testimonials continued, Eleanor sat quietly, her expression giving little away. But beneath her composed exterior, something was shifting a weight, lifting a tension, releasing. For 15 years, she had lived with the constant fear of discovery, of rejection, of being forced to flee once more. Now faced with the reality, she found it strangely liberating. Whatever happened next, the need for secrets was over. Finally, when all who wished to speak had done so, Mayor Fletcher turned to Eleanor. Miss Reed, or do you prefer Miss Hayes? Eleanor stood, her voice clear in the hushed church. Reed, Eleanor Reed, is who I am now, who I've been for 15 years. Fletcher nodded. Miss Reed, would you like to address the town? Eleanor surveyed the faces before her friends, neighbors, people. She had lived alongside for 2 decades. Some looked supportive, others uncertain, a few openly suspicious. All waited for her words. 20 years ago, I made a choice. She began. I chose to leave behind a life that had brought pain to others, even if that wasn't my intention. I chose to start over to build something honest and good. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Robert Reed knew who I was when he married me. Knew my past, my skills, everything I'd done. He believed people could change, if given the chance. Her voice softened slightly at the mention of her late husband. He was right. Eleanor's gaze moved to the Kentucky rifle she had brought with her, now resting against the pew beside her. My father gave me this rifle when I was 8 years old, taught me to shoot, to hunt, to protect myself in a world that wasn't always kind. Those skills kept me alive when I had nothing else. She ran her fingers lightly along the rifle's aged stock. Today they help keep this town alive. I don't regret that. But I understand if my presence here makes some of you uncomfortable now that you know the truth. Eleanor straightened up, meeting the mayor's gaze directly. If the council decides I should leave Clearwater Basin, I will do so. But know this, whether I stay or go. What happened today was necessary. The Blackwood gang would have destroyed this town, killed indiscriminately, taken whatever they wanted. Sometimes standing against that kind of evil requires certain capabilities. Her voice strengthened with conviction. I'm not ashamed of what I did today, and I'm not ashamed of the woman I've become over these 15 years. A long silence followed her words. Then, to everyone's surprise, Margaret Harrington stood up. Mayor Fletcher, I believe the council should vote now, she said firmly, and I move that the vote be public so everyone knows where each member stands. Fletcher looked uncomfortable but nodded. Very well. The question before the council is whether Eleanor Reed should be permitted to remain in Clearwater Basin, given the revelations about her past. He glanced around at the other council members. Those in favor of allowing her to stay, please raise your hands. Margaret's hand shot up immediately. Sullivan followed, then Harrison, then Palmer. Finally, after a moment's hesitation, Fletcher himself raised his hand. The vote is unanimous. He announced, a note of surprise in his voice. Eleanor Reed is welcome to remain in Clearwater Basin for as long as she wishes. A collective exhale seemed to pass through the church. Tension drained from the room, replaced by a strange mix of relief and newfound respect. Eleanor felt something unexpected well up inside her. Not just acceptance, but belonging. After 15 years of careful distance, of keeping parts of herself hidden away, she was finally truly home. As the meeting dispersed, people approached her one by one. Some offered quiet words of thanks, others simply a nod of acknowledgement. Wilson limped over, a half-smile on his weathered face. Well, that's settled, he said, though. There was still a question in his eyes. Is it? Eleanor asked quietly. There'll be questions from the territorial authorities once they arrive, Wilson said. But I reckon the statute of limitations has run out on most of what you did with the Faro gang. And there were never any witnesses to place you at that last job, just rumors. Except you. Eleanor pointed out, all I saw today was a citizen defending her town and her neighbors. Wilson replied, the rest is just stories, and who can say which ones are true? Eleanor studied him for a moment, reading between the lines. Wilson was offering her a choice, a clean slate if she wanted it. The past could remain buried, at least officially. Thank you, Daniel. Don't thank me yet, he cautioned. The stories about Steady Hand Hayes are going to get even more exaggerated now. Eleanor shook her head, a hint of amusement in her eyes. Let them talk. Stories have a way of fading with time. Some do, Wilson agreed. Others become legends. He nodded toward her rifle. Like a widow's ancient rifle that never misses. Eleanor picked up the Kentucky rifle, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. Her father's voice seemed to whisper from across the years. A Hayes never misses. Not a burden now, but a legacy she could finally embrace. Legends have their place, she said softly, but I prefer reality. 3 days later, the territorial marshals arrived from Helena, led by Marshal James Harker, a stern-faced man with iron-gray hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent decades in the saddle. They came with a wagon to transport the surviving members of the Blackwood gang to the territorial prison where they would await trial. Eleanor watched from the window of her trading post as the prisoners were led from the jail. Their hands and feet in irons, Isaac Blackwood walked with his head bowed, already broken by his brother's death. The Roth brothers followed with blank expressions. Webb was last limping from his wounded leg, his venomous gaze sweeping the street as if memorizing faces for future retribution. Wilson supervised the transfer, his side still bandaged, but his movements more fluid as healing progressed. His conversation with Marshal Harker seemed tense, the older lawman gesturing emphatically as Wilson stood his ground. Eleanor knew what they were discussing. News of Steady Hand Hayes' involvement in the Blackwood gang's defeat had spread quickly, reaching Helena. Before the marshals departed, Harker would have questions, uncomfortable ones, about a notorious outlaw living quietly in a frontier town. The bell above the door jangled, pulling Eleanor from her thoughts. Rebecca Palmer entered, medical bag in hand. "Thought I'd check on those stitches," she said, setting her bag on the counter. Eleanor rolled up her sleeve, revealing a neat row of stitches where one of Webb's bullets had grazed her arm during the gunfight, a minor wound she had almost forgotten. In the aftermath, Rebecca examined the injury with professional detachment. Healing nicely, no signs of infection. She glanced toward the window. Marshal Harker seems like a difficult man. He has a reputation. Eleanor acknowledged, incorruptible, unbending. Follows the letter of the law, no matter the circumstances. Has Wilson told him about you? Not the full story, I imagine. Just what was necessary to explain what happened here. Rebecca began replacing the bandage with a fresh one. And if Harker asks questions, starts digging. Eleanor met her gaze steadily. Then I'll answer them. I'm done running, Rebecca. The doctor nodded, securing the bandage. For what it's worth, I don't think you'll have to. This town stands behind you now. Once Rebecca had finished and left, Eleanor returned to the window. The prisoners had been loaded into the wagon, which was now pulling away from the jail. Wilson and Harker remained on the boardwalk, still deep in conversation. After a few minutes, the two men shook hands and Harker mounted his horse to follow the wagon. As they departed, Wilson turned and walked toward the trading post. Eleanor met him at the door. "He's not happy, I take it." Wilson removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "Harker's never happy." Man was born scowling. He stepped inside. He had questions about the shootout, wanted to know how a small town like ours managed to take down the Blackwood gang. "What did you tell him? That we were lucky, had some good people in the right places? That the Blackwoods got cocky and underestimated us?" Wilson's mouth quirked in a half-smile. Nothing that wasn't true. And he accepted that? Not entirely. He's heard the rumors that Steady Hand Hayes was here, that she was the one who killed Joshua Blackwood. Wilson met her gaze. But rumors aren't evidence. And even Harker knows better than to start questioning a whole town story, especially when that town just survived something like this. Eleanor nodded, relief mingling with gratitude for Wilson's discretion. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet," Wilson warned. "Harker's the kind who remembers things. He may be back someday with more questions. And I'll be here to answer them." Wilson studied her for a moment. "You mean that, don't you? You're really staying? This is my home, Daniel." Eleanor gestured around the trading post. "Has been for 15 years. That hasn't changed just because people now know more of my story. And the price on your head. The wanted posters. Most of those crimes are past the statute of limitations," Eleanor replied. "As for Westfield, the bank manager's son is alive because of what I did that day. His cousin is Marcus Sullivan. Sometimes justice and the law aren't quite the same thing." Wilson couldn't argue with that. He replaced his hat, moving toward the door. "Well then, reckon I'll see you at Sullivan's social tomorrow night." Eleanor's eyebrow arched in surprise. Social town's idea, celebrating our victory over the Blackwood gang. Wilson's expression was wry. "Though if you ask me, it's more about people wanting to talk about what happened to make it into a story they can tell. Makes it less frightening somehow." After Wilson left, Eleanor moved through the trading post, straightening shelves, checking inventory. The damage from the gunfight had been mostly repaired thanks to Sullivan and several other townspeople who had pitched in to help new glass. In the windows, splintered shelves replaced bullet holes in the walls patched and painted over. Only the Kentucky rifle remained exactly as it had been, hanging in its place of honor above the door. No longer a secret, no longer a relic of a past she was running from, now simply a part of who she was, acknowledged and accepted. As dust settled over Clearwater Basin, Eleanor climbed the stairs to her living quarters. Through the window, she could see the lights of the town glowing softly in the gathering darkness. In the distance, the mountains rose against the darkening sky. Solid and unchanging, Eleanor moved to the chest at the foot of her bed and opened it. Inside lay the wrapped bundle containing her twin Colts and the yellowed wanted posters. After a moment's consideration, she unwrapped the revolvers and placed them in the drawer of her bedside table. Not hidden away, but not prominently displayed either. Simply there, part of her past that she no longer needed to conceal. The wanted posters she gathered and carried to the small stove. One by one, she fed them to the flames, watching as they curled and blackened, turned to ash. Not denial, but acceptance. Those chapters were closed now. New ones were beginning. On the dresser sat the two daguerreotypes, Robert steady and kind in his formal pose, and little Sarah, forever 5 years old, forever smiling her father's smile. This time Eleanor did not turn Sarah's image face down. Instead, she straightened both frames, positioning them where the lamplight fell softly across the familiar faces. "I think they would have understood," she said aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who I was, who I've become." There was no answer. Of course, there never would be. But in the silence of her room, with the weight of secrets finally lifted, Eleanor felt a peace she hadn't known in 20 years. The social at Sullivan's saloon was in full swing by the time Eleanor arrived. The normally rough establishment had been transformed for the occasion. Tables pushed against the walls to create a dance floor. Lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the gathered townspeople. Someone had brought a fiddle, and the lively music filled the room, rising above the hum of conversation and laughter. Eleanor paused in the doorway, suddenly self-conscious. She had dressed simply, but with care, a dark blue dress. She rarely wore her hair down, instead of in its usual practical braid. The Colt revolver still hung at her hip, a compromise between the festive occasion and her unwillingness to go unarmed. For a moment, no one noticed her entrance, and Eleanor was tempted to turn around to retreat to the familiar solitude of the trading post. Then Margaret Harrington spotted her, raising a hand in greeting, and a ripple of awareness spread through the room. Conversations paused, heads turned, and Eleanor found herself the center of attention. A heartbeat of uncertainty hung in the air. Then Sullivan stepped forward, a genuine smile on his face. "Miss Reed," he said loudly enough for all to hear. "Glad you could join us. Can I offer you a drink?" "Whiskey," Eleanor replied, equally clear. "The good kind if you have it." Sullivan laughed. "For you, nothing but the best." Just like that. The moment of tension passed. Conversations resumed. People turned back to their partners, and the music swelled once more. Eleanor made her way to the bar, where Sullivan poured her a generous measure of his finest whiskey. "Wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted, sliding the glass toward her. "Wasn't sure myself," Eleanor replied, taking a sip. The whiskey was indeed good, smooth and warming. Not really one for gatherings. Well, the way I see it, today's worth celebrating, not just surviving the Blackwood gang, but maybe, Sullivan hesitated, choosing his words carefully, maybe finally being able to be yourself in this town. All of yourself. Eleanor considered this, surprised by the saloon-keeper's insight. "Maybe," she conceded, "takes some getting used to." "I imagine it does." Sullivan topped off her glass. "For what it's worth, I think Robert would be proud." Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the door where Sheriff Wilson had just entered. Their eyes met across the room, and he nodded in acknowledgement before being pulled into conversation by Harrison and Fletcher. "Did Wilson tell you what Harker said?" Sullivan asked, following her gaze. "About the reward money." Eleanor frowned. "What reward money?" "For the Blackwood gang, $500 on Joshua's head alone, more for the others. Since this town brought them down, the territorial governors awarded the bounty to Clearwater Basin." The town's getting the reward, Eleanor clarified, surprised. Sullivan nodded. Council's already decided to use it to build a proper schoolhouse one, with real glass windows and enough books for all the children. He gave her a meaningful look. James Palmer's over the moon about it. Says it's been his dream since he came here. Eleanor absorbed this a strange emotion welling up inside her. Once long ago, she had ridden with outlaws, taking what didn't belong to her. Now, ironically, the taking down of outlaws had provided for the town's future a kind of redemption she had never anticipated. Miss Reed. A hesitant voice broke into her thoughts. Michael Harrington stood nearby, his expression a mixture of shyness and determination. I was wondering, that is, if you wouldn't mind. I'd like to learn to shoot. Properly, I mean. And there's no one better to learn from than... Eleanor will do fine. Michael, she interrupted gently, seeing his discomfort with using her outlaw name. And, yes, I'd be happy to teach you, though I hope you never need to use those skills the way we did this week. The young man's face lit up. Thank you. I mean, when it would be a good time to start? Come by the trading post tomorrow afternoon. We'll begin with the basics. As Michael hurried off to share the news with his friends, Rebecca Palmer approached James at her side. The doctor's observant eyes took in Eleanor's appearance, noting the slight discomfort beneath her composed exterior. Not used to being the center of attention, are you? Rebecca asked with a knowing smile. Prefer to blend in? Eleanor admitted, habit. Well, you might as well get used to it. You're going to be a local legend now, whether you like it or not. Rebecca's expression softened. How's the arm? Healing fine, you do good work, doctor. James Palmer, normally reserved in Eleanor's presence, spoke up. Have you heard about the school? The reward money? Sullivan just told me. Congratulations, James. You've wanted proper facilities since you arrived. Yes, but... He hesitated, glancing at his wife before continuing. The council also voted to include a small library. We'd like to name it after Sarah, your daughter. Eleanor went very still, taken completely by surprise. My daughter, James nodded. The Sarah Reed Memorial Library. If that's all right with you. For a moment, Eleanor couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the unexpected gesture. Sarah had been gone for so long, her name rarely spoken aloud in Clearwater Basin. The thought that she would be remembered this way, that her brief life would leave a lasting mark on the town, touched Eleanor deeply. I'd be honored, she managed finally. Thank you. As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself drawn into conversations with people she had known for years, but had always kept at a distance. Without the burden of hiding her past, she discovered a freedom in these interactions that she had never experienced before. Wilson joined her later as the celebration began to wind down. He looked better than he had in days, the lines of pain around his eyes less pronounced. Quite a change, he observed, nodding toward the townspeople still talking and laughing throughout the saloon. A week ago, this town was holding its breath, afraid of shadows. Now look at them. They survived something they didn't think they could. Eleanor replied, that changes people. Yes, it does. Wilson's gaze was thoughtful. Sort of like someone else I know. Someone who spent 15 years hiding who she really is, only to discover that when the truth finally came out, the sky didn't fall after all. Eleanor smiled slightly. Still not comfortable with all the attention. It'll fade, Wilson assured her. Something else will happen. Some new story will take its place. That's how small towns work. And what about you, Sheriff? Eleanor asked. You helped cover for me with Harker. Not exactly by the book. Wilson shrugged. The book doesn't always get it right. Justice is more complicated than laws sometimes. He looked at her directly. Besides, this town needs you, not steady hand. Hayes the legendary shot, though that came in handy, but Eleanor Reed, the woman who's been here through blizzards and droughts and everything in between. The woman who knows what this place is worth fighting for. Eleanor was silent for a moment, moved by his words and the sentiment behind them. Thank you, Daniel. Don't mention it, he replied gruffly. Just doing my job, making sure this town and its people are protected. He finished his drink. Speaking of which, I should make my rounds. Even on celebration nights, someone has to keep an eye on things. After Wilson left, Eleanor found herself alone at the bar watching the remaining revelers with a sense of detachment tinged with newfound belonging. It was a strange feeling to be fully known, yet accepted to no longer carry the weight of a hidden past. Another Sullivan asked, gesturing to her empty glass. Eleanor shook her head. I should head back, long day tomorrow. Trading post or shooting lessons? Sullivan asked with a knowing smile, having overheard her conversation with Michael. Both, Eleanor replied, rising from her seat. Life goes on, Marcus. That it does, he agreed, then added more seriously. And sometimes it gets better if we let it. Eleanor considered his words as she walked home through the quiet streets of Clearwater Basin. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast Montana sky, like diamonds on velvet. The same stars she had watched as a girl in Kentucky. The same stars she had followed west with Robert. The same stars that had witnessed her darkest moments and her greatest joys. Now they watched over Clearwater Basin as it healed from the violence of the Blackwood gang and grew stronger for having faced it together. Eleanor Reed walked home through the quiet streets, the Kentucky rifle cradled in her arms, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of who she had been and who she had become. The trading post would need a few more repair stock to replenish, but life would go on different now that her secret was known, but perhaps more authentic for it. As she reached her store, Eleanor paused, looking back at the town settling in for the night. For the first time in 15 years, she felt completely present, completely herself. No more hiding, no more fear of discovery, just Eleanor Reed, shopkeeper of Clearwater Basin, and occasionally, when necessary, Steady Hand Hayes, the woman whose ancient rifle never missed tomorrow, would bring new challenges, new beginnings. But tonight, under the vast Montana sky, that was more than enough. 1 month later, the first snow of the season dusted Clearwater Basin in white, transforming the rugged landscape into something softer, almost ethereal. The mountains loomed even larger against the pale sky, their peaks already capped with heavy snow that would remain until late spring. Eleanor stood on the ridge behind her home. The Kentucky rifle balanced in her hands, its wooden stock smooth against her cheek. 50 yards away, a row of targets stood propped against a fallen log. Tin cans, small pieces of wood, a playing card tacked to a post. Beside her, Michael Harrington waited attentively, watching her every move with the earnestness of youth. Over the past month, he had proven to be an apt pupil, respectful, patient, willing to learn the fundamentals before attempting anything flashy. Remember, Eleanor said quietly, breath is everything. Inhale slowly, exhale halfway, then hold. Let the rifle become part of you, not something separate. She demonstrated the rifle rising and falling slightly with her breathing until it settled into perfect stillness. Her finger curled around the trigger with practiced ease. The rifle cracked, the sound echoing off the hillside 50 yards away. The playing card, a 5 of spades, jerked as the bullet tore through its center. Michael's eyes widened. How do you do that? I can barely see the card from here, let alone hit it. Eleanor lowered the rifle. Practice time. And understanding that shooting isn't just about your eyes and hands, it's about your mind, your breath, your entire being. She handed him the rifle, watching as he settled into position. His stance had improved dramatically since their first lesson. Feet properly placed, shoulders, relaxed, eyes focused. Take your time, she instructed. Don't rush, the target isn't going anywhere. Michael nodded, concentrating. His breathing slowed. His finger curled around the trigger, and the rifle spoke again. 50 yards away, one of the tin cans tumbled from its perch. Good, Eleanor said, genuine approval in her voice. Much better. The young man's face lit up with pride. Do you think I'll ever be able to hit the playing card? With enough practice, yes. Eleanor took the rifle back, reloading it with practiced efficiency. But remember, this isn't about becoming a gunfighter, Michael. It's about respecting the weapon, understanding its power, and knowing when not to use it. Like you did with Blackwood, Michael asked quietly. Eleanor paused, considering her answer carefully. The events of that day had already begun to take on the patina of legend in Clearwater Basin, growing more elaborate with each retelling. When I faced Blackwood, she said finally, I wasn't thinking about reputation or revenge. I was thinking about protection, about keeping this town and its people safe. That's the only reason to ever point a gun at another human being. Michael nodded, absorbing her words. My grandmother says you could have left when they came, taken your things and hidden in the hills until they were gone. Why didn't you? The question was direct, innocent in its simplicity, yet it struck at the heart of everything Eleanor had learned about herself over the past month. Because sometimes running away isn't the answer. She replied, sometimes you have to stand your ground even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. Eleanor handed the rifle back to him. Now let's see if you can hit that center. Can remember what I showed you about adjusting for wind. As Michael lined up his shot, Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the town below. From this vantage point, Clearwater Basin looked almost toy-like buildings, clustered along the main street. Thin wisps of smoke rising from chimneys, people moving about their daily business, tiny as ants from this distance. Yet it was home had been for 15 years and would be for however many more life granted her. Not a hiding place anymore, but a community she had helped build and, when necessary, defend. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. A rider was approaching from the east, moving at a steady pace along the main road into town. Eleanor watched, old instincts automatically assessing single rider, moving openly, no sign of threat. Probably a courier from Helena, or perhaps a visitor from one of the nearby settlements. Still, she found herself counting the ammunition left in her pocket, a habit as ingrained as breathing. Michael lowered the rifle, following her gaze. Someone coming. Just a traveler, looks like. Eleanor took the rifle from him. That's enough for today. Let's head back down. As they made their way down the hillside toward town, Eleanor's thoughts turned to the changes the past month had brought. The surviving members of the Blackwood gang had been tried in Helena, a swift proceeding that ended with all four sentenced to hang. Isaac Blackwood had cheated the gallows by taking his own life in his cell the night before the execution. The others had met their fate at dawn 3 days later. Marshal Harker had returned to Clearwater Basin, once ostensibly to update Sheriff Wilson on the proceedings. His real purpose, however, had been transparent: to observe Eleanor, to satisfy his curiosity about the rumors that Steady-Hand Hayes had resurfaced after all these years. Their encounter had been brief, tense, loaded with unspoken questions. In the end, Harker had left without making accusations or demands, though his parting words had carried a clear warning. Justice has a long memory, Miss Reed. It doesn't forget, even when others do. Eleanor had simply nodded. Neither do I, Marshal, neither do I. Now, as they reached the edge of town, Eleanor and Michael parted ways, he heading toward the hotel. To help his grandmother with the afternoon chores, she toward the trading post. The new schoolhouse was taking shape on the north end of Main Street, its timber frame already erected, windows waiting to be installed. James Palmer stood outside, deep in conversation with the carpenter, his hands moving animatedly as he described some detail of the planned interior. The Sarah Reed Memorial Library would occupy the building's east wing, a small room but filled with books ordered from back east, many selected by Rebecca for their educational value. Others had been donated by townspeople, treasured volumes, long hidden in trunks and closets, now shared for the benefit of all. Eleanor paused, watching the construction for a moment. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing Sarah's name attached to something so positive, so enduring. Her daughter's brief life would leave a mark on this place, on its future generations, a legacy of hope rather than violence. At the trading post, Eleanor found Sheriff Wilson waiting on the porch, his expression thoughtful as he watched her approach. The cold had deepened the lines around his eyes, but he moved more easily now, his wound fully healed. Shooting lessons? He asked, nodding toward the rifle in her hands. Michael's getting better, Eleanor replied, unlocking the door. Has good instincts when he stops overthinking. Wilson followed her inside, stamping snow from his boots. Saw a rider coming in from the east, recognized him, courier from Helena. Eleanor set the rifle on the counter. News, governor's considering a pardon. Wilson removed his hat, turning it in his hands. For Steady-Hand Hayes. Eleanor went very still. A pardon? Why? Territorial Marshal put in the word, said the actions at Westfield stopping Farrow from killing those hostages should be taken into account. That and your recent service to Clearwater Basin, Harker? Eleanor asked, incredulous. He's the one who pushed for this? Wilson's mouth quirked in a half smile. Said justice works both ways. that someone who risked their life to save others deserves consideration, even if their past isn't spotless. I never expected that, Eleanor admitted, genuinely surprised. Well, don't celebrate yet, it's just being considered. And even if it comes through, there's bound to be conditions. Eleanor nodded, understanding. A pardon wouldn't erase the past. Nothing could do that. But it would close the book officially, remove the specter of arrest that had hung over her for 20 years. Whatever happens, she said finally, I'm grateful for the thought. Wilson replaced his hat. Couriers bringing the official papers along with the mail. Should be here within the hour. He moved toward the door, then paused. By the way, there's something else you should know. What's that? Webb escaped. Wilson's expression was grim. 2 days ago, during transfer to another facility, killed a guard, stole a horse. They're tracking him, but he could be anywhere. Eleanor finished a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air settling over her. Wilson nodded. Just thought you should know. Keep your eyes open. After Wilson left, Eleanor moved through the trading post, checking inventory, rearranging shelves, her mind turning over this new information. Webb had been the youngest of the Blackwood gang, but perhaps the most vicious, driven by a need to prove himself, to establish his reputation through cruelty. And she had humiliated him not once, but twice. First by disarming him in her store, then by playing a key role in the gang's defeat. Men like Webb didn't forget such things, didn't forgive them. Eleanor's hand drifted to the Colt at her hip, a habit she had maintained even after the immediate danger of the Blackwood gang had passed. The weapon was a part of her, now acknowledged rather than hidden, just as her past was a part of her, not something to be ashamed of or to glorify, but simply one thread in the tapestry of her life. The lessons it had taught her, the skills it had honed, even the regrets it had sown, all had shaped her into the woman she was today. The bell above the door jangled, interrupting her thoughts. Rebecca Palmer entered, snowflakes melting in her blonde hair, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Thought you might like to see this, she said, unwrapping a package from beneath her coat. Just arrived on the stage from back east. Eleanor unwrapped the brown paper, revealing a book bound in dark leather. Gray's Anatomy, the gold lettering on the spine proclaimed, First Acquisition for the Library. Rebecca explained, I ordered it specially, thought it might inspire some of the children, especially the girls, to consider medicine as a future. Eleanor ran her fingers over the smooth leather, touched by the gesture. Sarah would have liked that. She was always curious about how things worked. Rebecca's expression softened. You don't talk about her much. It's been easier not to, Eleanor admitted. But lately I've been thinking that remembering out loud might be better than remembering in silence. I think you're right, Rebecca said. Our stories, all of them, even the painful ones, deserve to be told. After Rebecca left, Eleanor moved to the window, watching the slow drift of snowflakes outside. The courier from Helena would arrive soon, bringing news that might fundamentally change her status in the eyes of the law. Yet whatever the governor decided, Eleanor knew her place was here in this town, among these people who had finally seen all of who she was and accepted her anyway. The pardon, if it came, would be a relief, a closing of a chapter, but it wouldn't define her future. That had already been determined the day she chose to stand against the Blackwood gang, to use her skills, not for personal gain or revenge, but for protection. For home, Eleanor's gaze drifted to the Kentucky rifle, now returned to its place of honor above the door. Her father's voice seemed to whisper from the distant past. Remember, Eleanor, this rifle isn't just a weapon, it's a responsibility. What matters isn't just your aim, but what you choose to aim at. For the first time in many years, Eleanor felt she had aimed true. The long rifle's reckoning had come full circle. 1 year later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across Clearwater Basin's main street as Eleanor Reed stood on the porch of her trading post, watching the stagecoach disappear in a cloud of dust. The pardon from the territorial governor, signed and sealed, rested in the drawer inside official recognition of what the town already knew. Some outlaws deserved redemption. Her weathered hands, still steady as the day she put a bullet through Joshua Blackwood's heart, cradled the Kentucky long rifle, a family legacy that had saved a town, and in its own way her soul. Behind her, the newly constructed schoolhouse bustled with children's voices, the Sarah Reed Memorial Library, wing-drawing curious young minds into worlds beyond Montana's rugged borders. Tomorrow she'd continue teaching Michael Harrington the marksman's craft not for vengeance, but protection. "Steady hand, Hayes," muttered an old-timer passing by, tipping his hat respectfully. Eleanor nodded back, a small smile touching her lips. The name no longer stung. It was just another part of her story, like the Homestead Act land deed in her safe. The Purple Heart that had belonged to Robert and the ancient Winchester 73 that Wilson had gifted her from the sheriff's collection. In the distance, eagle-eyed as ever, she spotted a lone rider approaching from the east. Her hand instinctively brushed the Colt at her hip. Old habits die hard, especially when Webb remained unaccounted for. The frontier had taught her many lessons. The most important, a second chance was worth fighting for, and some fights never truly end. The long rifle's reckoning wasn't finished, just sleeping,